For 10 years, he'd dropped everything he touched. He couldn't even assemble a stool following the instructions. And now he sits in the mud of a foreign world beneath 2 moons, reading the composition of a rusty nail as if it were a product on a shelf. And he realizes that these useless hands have just done something they've never done before. But let's take it one step at a time. Dan Rourke opens his eyes and presses his face into the cold mud. His mouth tastes of rust and earth. A pile of trash lies right in front of his nose. Nails, broken pots, scraps of metal. It stinks, as if waste from 10 forges had been dumped here at once. He struggles to get up. His body won't obey him. His hands are shaking. His ribs ache. He rolls onto his back and sees the sky. Not his sky. The clouds are too low. The sunset is too red. And 2 moons. 2. Dan blinks. He rubs his eyes. The moons don't go away. And that's when the strangest thing begins. A line hangs right in front of his face. Semi-transparent, glowing blue. It pokes at a rusty nail and reports. 7%. Iron. Traces of silver. Available recipes, 214. Dan shifts his gaze to the broken pot. A new line. Fired clay. Magical capacity, 1 unit. Recipes, 87. He shakes his head, and lines are popping up everywhere. From a scrap of metal, from a torn belt, from a stone under his knee. The world around him speaks to him in the language of warehouse inventory. Every object hangs there like an item on a shipping manifest, with its composition, with its depreciation rate, with the number of recipes. And here's the rub. Dan Rourke toiled as a warehouse clerk for 10 years. He knows what a shipping manifest is, what sorting by category is, but he has no idea what magical conductivity is, and he certainly doesn't understand why a dead storekeeper is sitting in the filth of a foreign world reading the descriptions of junk like a product catalog. He stands up, staggers. The body is foreign, younger, thinner, weaker. The clothes hang as if on a hanger. Holy boots. No money, no documents, not a single clue except for these damned lines. He wanders out of the alley and sees a small town. Small, dusty, poor. Patchwork roofs, gray, weary people. Above the nearest building, a sign in a language he doesn't know, but he reads it fluently. The letters form words on their own. Thorna's blacksmith shop. And he feels uneasy. A foreign world, a foreign language he understands, a foreign body. And the ability to see the nature of things. It all came crashing down at once. Only this time, he didn't die. A broad-shouldered man with hands black with soot comes out of the smithy. He glances at Dan with an indifferent look, the way they look at a vagrant of whom hundreds have been seen here, and he walks away. Dan isn't offended. At the warehouse, they only noticed him when something went missing. He keeps walking. Lines spring from everything around him. The beam above the door, the iron bolt, the roof tiles. He closes his eyes. The lines fade. He opens them. They return. He stares intently at a single nail in the wall. The line unfolds into a list. A sharpened pin, 30 seconds. A hinge bracket, 2 minutes. An arrowhead, 4 minutes. Dozens of items, from a single nail. His brain works on autopilot, like in a warehouse when a new shipment arrives and everything has to be sorted into place within an hour. Only now the shipment has become the whole world. He steps out onto the square. A well in the middle. A boy of about 10 is sitting on the steps, crying, his face buried in his knees. In his hands, the fragments of something wooden with an iron head. The lines unfold instantly. A hammer handle. Condition 0. Broken. The head. A crack in the striking part. Beyond repair. Dan crouches down, asks what happened. The boy glances warily, like a stray cat. Then he squeezes the words out. He broke his father's hammer, the only one. His father is a blacksmith. The hammer cost more than they earn in a month. Tomorrow his father will see it, and there will be a beating. Dan looks around. The square is empty. Evening is falling. Trash is scattered on the ground by the well. 2 broken roof tiles, a fragment of an old scythe with a chipped blade, a leather strap from someone's bag, and that very same rusty nail. And then Dan does something he's never done before. He mentally connects them. And the system responds. A new window. Small hammer. Materials. Scythe fragment plus roof tile plus nail plus strap. Customization available. Dan looks at the boy's hands, at the calluses, at the grip. Left-handed. His palms are sweating. The system updates the recipe. Balanced for the left hand. Anti-slip grooves. Lightweight pommel. He grabs the scythe blade, the roof tile, the nail, the strap. The boy stares at him like he's crazy, a ragged vagrant gathering trash by the well. But Dan no longer cares how it looks. His hands move on their own. The system guides them, just as markings guide a furniture assembler. He snaps off the scythe blade along a line only he can see. He drives the nail with a stone precisely into the marked spot. He crushes a roof tile and rubs the powder into the cracks. The silica acts as a binder upon impact. He wraps a strap around the handle. Not just any wrapping. Every turn follows the pattern. The left edge is higher, notches at equal intervals, so a sweaty child's palm won't slip. 10 minutes, maybe 12. He hands the hammer to the boy. The boy takes it mechanically and freezes. The hammer fits in his hand as if it had always been there. The boy grips the handle, loosens his grip, grips it again, lifts it, lowers it. Surprise on his face, then relief, then something close to happiness. He asks where it came from. Dan nods toward the ground. From there, from the trash. The boy looks at the ground, at the hammer, at Dan, and runs off, clutching the hammer to his chest. Dan stays by the well. His hands are trembling, not from fatigue. He has just picked up an object from the trash, with the very same hands that used to drop everything. The hands had been the curse of his entire past life, and for the first time in a long time, he doesn't feel useless. He finds an empty shed behind the smithy. It smells of hay and old iron. He lies down on the straw. The lines fade. 2 moons shine through cracks in the roof, and far to the north, the sky is a strange color. Not red, gray-green, sickly. Dan doesn't know it's the rot, doesn't know it's creeping south, doesn't know that ordinary weapons blunt against it like against water. He doesn't know that in 6 months, this filth will reach Bren Hollow. He just thinks about the hammer, and about how maybe tomorrow he'll do something else. The morning begins with a crash. The barn door swings open. Standing in the doorway is that blacksmith. Black hands, angry eyes. He grabs Dan by the collar and drags him out like a kitten. He jabs a finger in his face, asks what he did to his son. Behind his father stands a boy with a hammer in both hands. The blacksmith growls. His son came running in yesterday with a tool they'd never had before, made in a way they don't make things in this town. The balance and grip are on par with a master with 20 years of experience. And the only stranger in town is this vagrant who slept in his shed. Dan is telling the truth. He pieced it together from trash by the well, from a broken scythe, some roof tiles, a nail, and a strap. The blacksmith is silent. His face shifts from disbelief to irritation, then back to disbelief. Then he picks up the hammer. He turns it over in his hands, checks the balance. He taps the pommel with his fingernail, sniffs the handle, and turns pale. Says it's impossible, that you can't make a blade like this from a broken scythe, that tile shards won't hold a joint, that a strap from the ground doesn't coil like that. Dan shrugs. He doesn't understand how it works himself. He just sees the lines and follows them. The blacksmith stares at him for a long time. Then he says his name is Thorn, that Dan can use the shed as long as he pays for the space with his labor, and that tonight he'll show him what needs fixing. It's not gratitude. Thorn looks at Dan as if he were a tool that needs to be tested before being put to work. But it's a roof over his head and a chance not to starve to death in the first week. Dan nods. Thorn goes into the smithy. The boy lingers. He smiles and runs after his father. Dan stands on the morning street of Bren Hollow. Lines float before his eyes. Every stone, every board, every nail in the wall. The whole town is a warehouse, a huge, cluttered warehouse that hasn't seen an inventory taker in 100 years. And Dan Rourke, a storekeeper with 10 years' experience, stands in the middle of it and sees every item. Thorn wasn't joking about the work. By the end of the first day, he'd dumped a pile of junk from the back room of the blacksmith shop in front of Dan. Bent horseshoes, broken tongs, cracked casting molds, rusty hinges, scraps of metal that had piled up over the years and were too good to throw away, but impossible to use. Thorn said that if Dan really could do what he claimed, he should make something useful out of this pile. Dan sat down on the ground in front of it, and the pages unfolded like a catalog. Hundreds of items, thousands of recipes. He spent 3 hours simply going through and sorting them, arranging them by composition, by strength, by hidden properties that only he could see. Thorn peeked in an hour later. He saw neat rows of sorted metal. He grunted. He left. He peeked in 2 hours later. He saw that Dan was assembling a set of hooks for a hoist out of the bent horseshoes. He stood there. He left without a word. By morning of the second day, 12 items lay on the workbench. Hooks for pulling out horseshoes, a clamp for workpieces made from broken pliers, 3 files of different grits made from scraps, a set of pins, a bracket for attaching to the anvil, and odds and ends that Dan had made on the side because his hands were used to stop. Thorn examined each item for 10 minutes, silently, sniffing, twisting them in his hands, checking for bend and impact. Then he sat down on a stool and rubbed his face with his palms for a long time. Finally, he asked where Dan had studied. Dan replied that he hadn't studied anywhere. Thorn asked what kind of family he came from. Dan said he wasn't from any. Thorn asked if he had a guild rank. Dan didn't know what that was. Thorn looked at him the way the shift supervisor had looked at Dan when he mixed up the markings, a mixture of anger and bewilderment. Then he said that things didn't work that way in Arkland. That materials only obeyed those with the right of the house or a guild patent. That a simpleton couldn't take a rusty horseshoe and turn it into a master-class tool. That this was either an explanation or a problem. Dan said nothing. He understood himself that the problem had already begun. Thorn told him not to stick his neck out of the smithy for now and not to show anyone what he could do. Dan nodded. And he broke that rule by lunchtime. A woman brought a broken pot to the smithy. She asked him to patch it up. Thorn refused. He said there was a crack in the bottom and there was no point in fixing it. A new pot costs 3 silver coins. The woman turned pale. 3 silver coins were a fortune to her. She left with the broken pot under her arm. Dan caught up with her around the corner. He asked to take a look at the pot. The lines unfolded. Copper alloy, condition 15%, a 7-centimeter crack in the bottom, but the walls were intact. And there was one feature in this pot's copper that no one had seen: traces of tin in the composition. Insignificant, but sufficient. The system suggested a solution, not a repair, a remanufacture. From this pot and a pinch of sand from the street, 2 smaller pots could be made, with thinner walls, but with redistributed metal, without a crack. Dan asked the woman for 10 minutes. She looked at him skeptically but handed over the pot. 12 minutes later, he handed her 2 pots, smaller than the old one, but intact, with smooth walls, with comfortable handles made from the bent rim. The woman took them. She turned them over in her hands, tested them with her fingernail, and she began to cry. Not from happiness, from relief. Dan didn't understand back then that in this world, things meant far more to people than money. A thing was status, protection, a guarantee that you'd survive the winter. Losing a pot meant 3 months of eating dry rations or going into debt to a loan shark. And debt to a loan shark meant near slavery. The woman left with 2 pots. By evening, 3 streets knew about the vagabond at Thorne's smithy. By the morning of the 3rd day, there was a line outside the shed. Thorne was furious. Not because Dan was helping people, but because people had stopped bringing orders to the smithy. Why pay silver to a blacksmith when a vagabond makes things out of trash for free? Dan realized this when Thorne didn't bring him dinner. He sat in the shed, hungry, staring at his hands. Hands that knew how to make things, but didn't know how to think ahead. It was the same in the warehouse. He rearranged the pallets however he thought was most convenient, and didn't consider that the loaders were used to the old layout. He helped his colleagues with their reports and didn't think the boss would decide they could be cut. Golden hands, on the contrary. Only now his hands were truly golden. But his head was still the same. On the morning of the 4th day, Dan went to see Thorne. He said he'd been wrong, that he shouldn't have worked past the blacksmith's shop. He proposed a deal. He'd only fix what Thorne couldn't or wouldn't fix. Hopeless junk. Things customers bring to be thrown away, things that Thorne would have sent to the dump anyway. Thorne listened in silence. Then he asked what Dan wanted in return. Food, a spot in the shed, and access to the junk pile behind the smithy. Thorne snorted, but he agreed. That's how the first week began. Dan worked from dawn till dusk. The lines before his eyes never faded for a moment. He repaired what couldn't be repaired, not because the items were hopeless, but because no one saw in them what he saw. A broken shovel with a hidden vein of hardwood in its handle. A torn boot whose leather contained traces of tanning solution that made it twice as strong. A cracked lantern whose glass turned out to be quartz that, after remelting, held light 3 times longer. Every object he picked up told him a story, and every time he found something in that story that others didn't see. But his hands were getting tired. His eyes burned from endless lines of code. By the end of the 5th day, Dan found he couldn't even lift a spoon. His fingers wouldn't obey him. The muscles in his forearms were cramping. The system didn't grant endless stamina. It guided his hands, but his hands were human. He lay in the shed and counted the objects he'd made over the week. 38. 38 things made from trash, and not a single one had come to him for free. On the morning of the 6th day, a girl came to the shed. Dan heard footsteps and turned around. Heijin was standing in the doorway. He didn't know her name yet. He saw only a slender figure in a work apron, short-cropped hair, dark, attentive eyes. She didn't speak. Silently, she placed a bowl of porridge in front of him, a mug of water, and a sign. The note had one word on it: eat. Dan took the bowl. The porridge was warm. He ate and watched the girl. She stood there and waited. When he finished, she took the bowl. She placed a second sign. It read, "The blacksmith said to tell you, you're not working today." Dan wanted to object, but Hedgen had already left, quietly, just as she had come. He later learned that she was mute, that she had been working in the smithy since she was 8, that Thorn had taken her in as an orphan because there was no one else to care for her, and because she worked for 2 without asking for anything, that she communicated with signs and gestures, and that most people in town didn't bother to read them. But that was later. And at that moment, Dan was simply sitting in the shed with an empty bowl, thinking about how someone had brought him food, that someone had noticed he hadn't eaten, and that this simple act meant more than all 38 things he'd done in a week. By the end of the first week, Dan knew the lay of the land. Bren Hollow was a town of just over 200 families, a brown iron mine to the east, Thorn's blacksmithy, the only one in town, Old Bem's general store, where they sold everything from salt to rope, a small garrison of 5 guards who protected the mine from the creatures of the forest, and the shadows to the north. Those very same gray-green shadows that Dan had seen on his first night. Thorn said one word: rot. And he didn't explain anything else, but the boy did. Thorn's son was named Kai. He was 10 and talked non-stop. Rot is a curse from the north. It creeps slowly. It devours the earth and the trees and the beasts. It turns them into shapeless and terrifying. Ordinary weapons don't work on the creatures of rot. You need special ones, made of starlight iron or blessed silver or other materials that cost so much that all of Bren Hollow couldn't scrape together enough for a single blade. The big cities are protected. They have guilds and masters and materials. But small towns like Bren Hollow are just waiting, or fleeing south if they can make it. Dan listened, and the lines before his eyes trembled. He looked at the brown iron from the mine that Thorn had stockpiled in the corner of the yard. Brown iron, 100% quality, low grade, magical conductivity 0.5 units. Available recipes? 12. 12 recipes from fresh ore. Not 200, not 300. 12. The world hadn't lied. Low-grade material yielded little. But Dan looked at the pile of junk behind the smithy, at the rusty nails and broken pots and scraps of everything under the sun. And he didn't see 12 recipes. He saw thousands. Because trash isn't just one material. Trash is dozens of materials mixed together, and every combination unlocked new lines. Dan sat on the barn threshold and looked at the trash heap the way a storekeeper looks at the warehouse after taking inventory. When every box is in place, every barcode has been scanned, and you finally see the whole picture. He didn't yet know what to do with this picture, but for the first time in 10 days of 2 lives, he knew exactly what he would do tomorrow. The second week began with a scream in the street. Dan peeked out of the shed and saw a girl walking down the main road toward the city gates. She was limping. Her left leg buckled with every step. A scabbard hung behind her back, empty. In her right hand, she dragged a sack from which pieces of metal protruded. The lines appeared before Dan's before he had time to think. Fragments of a blade. Star iron. Condition 4 to 11%. 7 fragments. Total mass 1.2 kilograms. Magical conductivity 0 to 6 units. traces of blood on 3 fragments. The girl reached the well and sat down right on the ground. She dropped the bag, buried her face in her knees. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't make a sound. People walked around her, not out of cruelty, out of habit. In Bren Hollow, other people's problems were a luxury. Dan approached, sat down beside her, remained silent. A minute later, she lifted her head and looked at him. His eyes were hard. His face was scraped. His cheekbone was cut open. She said that if he'd come to stare, he could go back. Dan said he'd come to look at the shards. She blinked, looked at the bag, then at him, then back at the bag. She asked if he was a blacksmith. Dan said something to that effect. She shook the shards out onto the ground, 7 pieces of what had once been a sword. The blades had completely unfurled, and for the first time, Dan saw truly precious material. Star iron. He'd heard that name from Kai, ore that falls from the sky, so rare that a single ingot is worth a village. A sword made of star iron could cut through the creatures of rot. It could channel magical power. It could be a weapon for generations. And there it lay on the ground by the well, in 7 pieces. The girl said her name was So-yeon, that she was a hunter, that she'd been saving up for this blade for 5 years. She worked for the guild for pennies, tracked down creatures, hauled carcasses, cleaned equipment for the masters. 5 years, and finally bought a sword. Not new, second-hand, with flaws, but made of starlight steel. And in her very first battle with a creature of rot, the sword broke. The creature was small, a scout, but when So-yeon struck it, the blade snapped along a hidden crack that had been there from the very beginning. She had been sold a defective blade. Dan looked at the shards, and the lines told him everything. A hidden crack in the 5th fragment. A manufacturing defect. Uneven tempering. Someone from the guild sold the hunter a defective blade at full price because she was a nobody. A commoner with no lineage or rank. Who could she complain to? So-yeon said she'd taken the shards to 3 forges on her way here. They all said the same thing. Only a master of at least 4th rank can remelt star iron. Such masters live in the capital. The work costs more than a new blade. The shards are now worth less than the sack she's carrying them in. Dan held out his hand. "Go ahead." She looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she nodded. He took a single fragment. The lines flashed brighter than from any object he had held before. Star iron, 89%. Carbon matrix. Magical conductivity, 6 units per gram. Available recipes. The list began to scroll. And it didn't stop. 200 lines, 300, 500. Dan stopped counting. From a single shard, the system offered more options than from the entire scrap heap behind the forge. But Dan wasn't looking at the general list. He was looking at a single line at the very top. Blade. Reforging from fragments. Materials. 7 fragments plus a binding agent. Assembly time, 4 hours. Special parameters. Customization available. Specify user. Dan looked at So-yeon, at her hands. Wide palms with tough calluses, right-handed, long fingers, power grip with a short swing. Left shoulder slightly lower than the right. Old injury. The lines updated instantly. Blade, reforged, personalized. Balance shifted toward the guard by 3 centimeters. Compensation for the left shoulder. Taper toward the tip for a chopping style with a short swing. The hilt is 1.5 centimeters longer than standard. The notch on the 3rd section is preserved as a stiffening rib. Dan read the last line twice. The notch is preserved. The system did not suggest removing the defect. It suggested incorporating it, making it part of the new blade, both its scar and its strength. Dan told So-yeon he needed 4 hours and a place to work. She asked how much he wanted for it. He said nothing. She stood up, said nothing comes for free and that she doesn't take handouts. She turned and walked toward the gate. Dan called after her that she could leave and carry those shards around for another 5 years, or she could sit down and wait 4 hours. So-yeon stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood there for half a minute. Then she came back. She sat on the edge of the well. She crossed her arms, and she said that if he didn't show results in 4 hours, she'd break both his arms. Dan nodded. Thorn gave him a spot by the forge, not out of kindness, out of curiosity. The blacksmith saw the shards of star iron and his hands trembled, not from fear, from desire. He had seen such material twice in his life, and both times through the window of a shop in the county town. Dan worked. The system guided his hands. But this was no simple assembly. The stardust resisted. It was alive. The lines flickered and changed with every blow. Each fragment had to be heated to the exact temperature the system displayed. Not a degree more, not a degree less. The binding agent turned out to be a mixture Dan had put together from whatever was at hand. Coal dust from the furnace, quartz sand from under the anvil, and 3 drops of blood that So-yeon had left on the shards. The system used even that, the owner's blood as a marker for personalization. Dan worked for 4 hours and 20 minutes. By the end, he was reeling. His hands were burning. His eyes saw the lines with a delay. He laid the blade on the anvil and stepped back. Thorn approached first. He picked up the blade and dropped it back onto the anvil. Not because of its weight. His fingers opened of their own accord. He said it wasn't his, that the blade itself decides who it belongs to. Dan didn't understand, but So-yeon did. She stepped forward, reached out her hand. She took the blade by the hilt and froze. The sword fit into her palm as if it had grown from it. The balance was perfect for her hand. The length of the hilt was perfect for her grip. The weight was perfect for her shoulder. She made a test swing. The blade whistled through the air, easily, quickly, without strain. So-yeon swung again, and again, and again. Each strike was faster than the last. She moved like a person who had put on a pair of properly fitting shoes for the first time after 10 years in someone else's boots. Then she stopped. She turned the blade and saw the notch. That very one, from the old blade, built into the new one. Her fingers traced it. She was silent. Then she asked why he had left it there. Dan said it was in the blueprint, that the system had suggested keeping the notch as a stiffening element, that technically it made the blade stronger at the point of impact. So-yeon looked at the notch, then at Dan. Then she said she would defend him. Dan said it wasn't necessary. So-yeon said she hadn't asked for his opinion. Thorn stood to the side and said nothing. His face wore an expression Dan had already learned to recognize. A mixture of admiration and fear. That's how you look at something that shouldn't exist. That evening, So-yeon took a corner in the barn. She spread out her travel bag. She placed the blade nearby, and she said that starting tomorrow, she would be on guard duty. Dan asked what she was guarding him from. Yeon replied, "From everyone." Dan didn't understand. He would understand in a week. On the 8th day, a caravan arrived in Bren Hollow. 12 wagons. Merchants from the south were carrying cloth, salt, and spices. On the return trip, they planned to load brown iron from the mine. Business as usual. Caravans passed through the town once every 2 weeks. But this caravan brought something else. News. A rot beast had attacked the village of Ulm, 3 days' journey to the north. Not a scout, a full-sized beast, 10 meters tall, a shapeless mass that devoured 3 houses and 16 people before retreating at dawn. The guild sent a detachment 5 days later. By then, the village was already gone. A caravan driver was telling the story in the square. People listened in silence. Dan stood in the crowd and looked at their faces. Fear, not panic. The quiet, familiar fear of people who have long known that help won't arrive in time. Ulm was 3 days' journey away. Bren Hollow could be next, or in a month, or in 6 months, or tomorrow. No one knew. So-yeon stood nearby, her hand resting on the hilt of her new blade. She listened to the caravan driver, her jaw clenched so tightly that her skin turned white. After the story, she took Dan aside. She said that one blade wasn't enough, that she alone couldn't stop a full-sized creature, that the city needed weapons. Lots of them. And not just any weapons. Dan knew that. He'd known it ever since Kai told him about the rot. But it was one thing to know. It was another matter to stand in the square and hear that 16 people had turned into a shapeless mass because they didn't have the right weapons. He went to the trash heap behind the smithy. He sat down in front of it and began to count. The lines unfolded like an endless inventory list. He counted the materials, he considered combinations, and he looked at recipes marked "Increased Effectiveness Against Organic Magic." There were few of those, very few. Trash remained trash. There was no stardust in it, no blessed silver, nothing that this world considered capable of resisting rot. But the lines didn't lie. There were traces of silver in the rusty iron. In the broken pottery, in the old leather, there were remnants of tanning agents made from willow bark. And willow bark in this world had a property it didn't have in the old one. It resonated with magical energy, weakly, barely perceptibly, 0.2 units per gram. But it resonated. Dan spent 3 days on calculations, not on crafting, on calculations. He went through the entire trash heap, every item, every shard, every splinter. He mapped out the resources in his head just as he had mapped out the shelves in the warehouse. Item A-17 contains 4 units of rusty iron with traces of silver. Item B-3 contains broken ceramics with a high quartz. Item B-9 contains leather scraps treated with willow tanning. On the 3rd day of calculations, the system produced a recipe. Not a weapon, a coating. A mixture of quartz dust, willow extract, and silver oxide extracted from rusty iron. When applied to any metal object, it increases its resistance to organic magic by 40%, lasts 6 to 12 hours. Not starlight iron, not a legendary artifact, a temporary fix made from junk. But 40% is the difference between blunting like water and leaving a cut. Between "we're all going to die" and "we have a chance." Dan showed the recipe to Thorn, not the lines. Only he could see the lines. He showed the ingredients and explained what to do. Thorn listened. Then he was silent for a long time. Then he said that if it was true, Dan had just invented what the guild had been struggling with for 20 years. Dan said he hadn't invented it, that he'd figured it out by studying the properties of the materials. Thorn shook his head. He said it made no difference, and that if the guild found out, Dan was finished. So-yeon was nearby and heard everything. She asked why he'd be finished. Thorn explained. In Arkland, knowledge of a formula is equivalent to wealth. The formula for a protective coating made from trash that provides 40% resistance to rot is worth more than this city. If the Guild of Masters finds out that some nameless vagrant has found a formula that devalues their monopoly on expensive materials, they won't reward him. They'll either buy him out, or lock him up, or eliminate him. Dan sat and listened. Inside, he felt empty. He had created something that could save people, and that very thing had put him in the crosshairs. It was the same in the warehouse. He once found a way to optimize the layout that saved 3 hours a week. The boss didn't praise him. The boss said that if management found out it was possible to work faster, they'd cut the shift in half, and he told him to forget it. Dan didn't forget it then. He won't forget it now. He told Thorn that the formula had to be used. What if that creature came to Bren Hollow? The people would have nothing to defend themselves with. That he wouldn't sit on the formula and wait for the guild to approve it. Thorn looked at him for a long time. Then he said one word: "Fool," and went to stoke the fire in the furnace. They worked together. For the first time, Thorn smelted, Dan assembled. He-Jin silently handed him the materials. So-Yun stood by the door and looked out onto the street, just in case someone came at the wrong time. Over the course of the night, they made 20 batches of the coating, a thick gray-blue paste in clay pots. Dan applied the coating to an old axe from the shed. The readings confirmed it. Resistance to organic magic, 41%. Duration, 9 hours. He handed the axe to So-Yun. She ran her finger along the blade, looked at Dan, nodded. The caravan left the next morning. The caravan driver took the news with him, not about the coating, about a vagabond by the smithy who makes impossible things out of trash. Dan didn't know that this news was already traveling along the trade routes to the south, to the Guild of Masters, to the slave traders, to the nobles who collect useful people the way others collect blades. He stood by the smithy and watched the dust settle behind the departing caravan. So-Yun stood beside him. She was silent. She placed her hand on the sword. He-Jin came out with a sign. The sign read, "Caution." Dan looked at her, at So-Yun, at the smithy behind him, at the town around him. And he realized that the quiet life of a storekeeper by the garbage heap had ended before it began. 3 days after the caravan left, Abigail Carr arrived in Bren Hollow. Dan didn't know her name. He saw a woman with red hair pulled into a disheveled bun walking down the street like someone who didn't care where she was going. A tattered sack on her back, 3 leather pouches on her belt stuffed to the brim, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, and an expression Dan recognized instantly. That was what the colleagues who'd been fired a week before New Year's looked like. Anger mixed with desolation. The lines appeared as soon as she came closer, not on her, on the pouches. The composition of the powders inside: sulfuric anhydride, moon salt, iron vine extract. Substances Dan hadn't seen in local stocks. Rare, expensive, and useless on their own. The lines pulsed like an alarm in a warehouse when goods are stored improperly. These substances were being stored incorrectly. Sulfuric anhydride next to lunar salt would react in 6 hours. In 12 hours, both would turn into inert dust. This woman was wasting resources right now and didn't know it. Dan walked up to her. He told her she needed to separate the pouches. She stopped. She looked up at him. She wasn't tall, and that made her angry glare even more piercing. She asked who he was and how he knew what was in her pouches. Dan said he could see the composition of the items. She was silent for 3 seconds. Then she burst out laughing, a dry, sharp laugh. She said it was the best lie she'd heard in a month. Dan said there was about 200 grams of sulfuric anhydride in the left bag, about 150 grams of lunar salt in the middle one, and that in 5 hours both substances would turn into useless dust if she didn't move the anhydride away from the salt. She stopped laughing. She opened the left pouch. She sniffed it. Her expression changed. She snatched the middle pouch, unhooked it from her belt, and flung it 2 meters away. Then she looked at Dan, no longer laughing. She asked how he'd done it. Dan pointed to his eyes. Lines, properties, recipes, everything he could explain in 3 words. She looked at him the way a scientist looks at the result of an experiment that wasn't supposed to work. Then she introduced herself. Abigail Carr, a former third-rank alchemist of the guild. Former, because she was expelled. For heresy. Dan asked what kind of heresy. She said she mixed recipes, that in the Alchemists Guild every formula is law, passed down the chain from master to apprentice. It cannot be changed. Mixing formulas from different schools is... She mixed them. She created a compound that worked better than both of the originals. Her mentor said it was heresy, that violating the formula was a violation of order, that the result didn't matter if the process was wrong. They stripped her of her rank. They confiscated her lab. They kicked her out of the guild gates with whatever she had on her, 3 pouches of powders, a sack of clothes, and knowledge that no one wanted to acknowledge. Dan listened, and it seemed to him that he was hearing his own story, only instead of a warehouse, the guild, instead of a boss, a mentor, and instead of the rule, don't touch other people's palates, the rule, don't touch other people's formulas. He led her to the smithy. Thorne looked at the redhead and said this wasn't a homeless shelter. So-Yun said there was room for 1 more person in the barn. Jin silently brought a bowl of porridge. Abby. She immediately said her name was Abby and that Abigail was too long. Abby sat in the corner of the barn and asked Dan 114 questions that first evening. He didn't count. So-Yun did. And on the 115th, she said that if Abby didn't shut up, she'd throw her out the door. Abby fell silent for exactly 10 seconds and asked the 116th question. But these questions were important. Abby was the first person in this world who understood what Dan was doing. Not on the level of whether it was magic or a gift, on the level of chemistry, materials science, logic. When Dan explained the principle of the protective coating against rot to her, she sat motionless for a minute. Then she said that if they added iron vine extract from her supplies to the formula, the effectiveness would rise from 40 to 55%. Dan checked through the system. 57%. Abby was right. And she was even being a little modest. They worked for 3 nights in a row. Abby contributed her knowledge. Dan saw the properties. The system brought it all together. The results were such that Thorne stopped grumbling and started taking notes. 2nd-generation coating. Rot resistance 57%. Duration 14 hours. Cost of materials 0. All made from trash and weeds growing along the road. Dan looked at the bowls of the new mixture and shivered. Not from the cold, from the realization. In 3 nights, he and Abby had done what the guilds hadn't been able to do in 20 years. Not because they were geniuses, but because the guilds forbade mixing knowledge. Every recipe existed in isolation. Every master saw only his own piece. No one looked at the whole picture. Like in a warehouse where every department keeps its own records and no one does a general inventory. Abby said Dan was crazy, that he did the impossible literally every day, and that she would stay because, for the first time in 2 years, her knowledge had been useful to someone. Dan said he was glad. So-Yun said the shed was about to burst at the seams. Jin brought a sign. We need a table. She was right. The shed was no longer big enough. 4 people, materials, tools, coated plates, scrap, and blanks. None of it fit in a 3 by 4 meter space. Dan looked at the abandoned barn across the road from the smithy. The lines unfolded. Walls. Condition, 45%. Roof. Condition, 22%. Available repair recipes, 34. Required materials. Everything lying in the trash heap behind the smithy. He went to the village elder. The village elder's name was Bem, the same old man who ran the shop. Dan proposed a deal. He would repair the barn at his own expense, using materials he found himself. In return, he would get the right to use it as a workshop. Bem asked what kind of workshop. Dan said a workshop that makes things out of whatever is available. Bem asked what exactly. Dan said, out of nothing. Bem looked at him like he was a fool. Then he remembered the pots, and the horseshoes that Dan had repaired last week, and the bolt on his own bench that Dan had straightened out of a bent rod in 3 minutes. Bem agreed. The repairs took 2 days. Dan worked with the system to the fullest. Every board, every beam, every nail was selected for its properties and driven into the point of maximum strength. He reinforced the walls with struts made from old shafts. He patched the roof with shingles mixed with quartz grit, according to the system's recipe. The resulting material was twice as strong as the original tiles. So-Yun helped carry the beams. Abby mixed the compounds. Jin carried water and tools. Thorn came by to grumble and ended up staying to help. Kai ran around and got in everyone's way equally. By the evening of the second day, the barn had become a workshop. Inside, a workbench made of old planks reinforced using the system's method. Shelves made of scraps. A place for the furnace. A place for Abby's alchemical experiments. A quiet corner for Jin. And a spot by the door for So-Yun. Jen stood in the middle of the workshop and looked around. 4 walls, a roof, a table, tools, people. He had exactly the same setup in the warehouse. Walls, a roof, a table, tools. But there were no people. There were colleagues. Those are different things. He hung a sign above the door. Hyejin had written it, in neat, clear letters. The Workshop. From nothing. So-Yun said the name was silly. Abby said the name was perfect. Thorn said he didn't care either way and told them not to disturb him while he worked. Hyejin stood nearby and looked at the sign. Then she looked at Dan. And for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she smiled. Not widely, just the corners of her lips. But Dan saw it. That night he lay in his spot in the workshop. Not in the shed, in the workshop. So-Yun was sleeping by the door, sword at her side. Abby was tossing and turning in the corner, muttering spells in her sleep. Hyejin was curled up in a ball on her cot. Quiet. Peaceful. Dan stared at the ceiling he'd patched up himself and thought about how 2 weeks ago he'd been lying face down in the mud, nameless and without purpose. And now he had a roof over his head, a table, work, and people who, for some reason, had stayed. In the north, the sky was gray-green again, closer than on the first night, just a little, but closer. Dan closed his eyes and thought that tomorrow he needed to make more coverings, a lot, enough for the whole town. Because if the rot reaches Bren Hollow, these people need to have a chance, even if it's made of trash, even if it's temporary, but a chance. For the next 2 weeks, Dan didn't leave the workshop. He brewed the coating, batch after batch. Quartz dust, willow extract, silver oxide from rusty iron, iron vine extract from Abby. The system guided every step, proportions, temperature, curing time. Dan worked like an assembly line, like in a warehouse during peak season when the trucks roll in one after another and you stop counting the boxes. Only here, instead of boxes, There were clay pots filled with a gray-blue paste that could save a life. With Jan went out for willow bark every morning. The grove grew an hour's walk to the southeast. She'd return with a sack of bark on her back and silently dump it by the entrance. Abby ground the ingredients and experimented with the proportions. Every evening she slipped Dan a new combination and asked, "Can you test this one?" The system obediently spouted out numbers. 8 out of 10 of Abby's variations were worse than the basic recipe. 2 were better. She memorized both and moved on. Hey Jean kept track. No requests, no instructions. She simply started a notebook and began writing things down. How many plates were ready? How much material was used? How much was left? Dan saw her notes on the third day and froze. Neat columns, neat numbers. An accounting system that was a carbon copy of the inventory log. He hadn't taught her that. She'd watched him mutter numbers while he worked and built her own system. Dan looked at her. She stood there with the notebook, waiting for his reaction. He said it was the best record-keeping he'd seen in 2 worlds. Heijin lowered her eyes and left. But from that day on, the notebook was always on the table. By the end of the second week, they had 112 portions of the coating, enough to treat all the weapons and tools in Bren Hollow twice. Dan took the first batch to Elder Bem. Bem turned the small pot in his hands. He sniffed it. He asked what it was. Dan explained. "A coating. You apply it to metal. It provides protection against rot for 14 hours. Bem asked how much it cost. Dan said it was free. Bem set the dish on the table and looked at Dan as if he'd offered him poison. In Arkland, free meant 2 things. Either it was useless, or it was a trap. Dan didn't realize this right away. He handed out 10 small plates on the street. People took them, sniffed them, placed them on windowsills and left them alone. No one applied the coating to their weapons. No one tried it. So-Yun said he was an idiot. That you couldn't just hand out things and expect gratitude. That people don't trust what they don't understand. Dan said he just wanted to help. So-Yun replied that help that isn't accepted isn't help. It's self-comfort. Her words hit home. Dan sat on the workshop threshold and thought. At the warehouse, it was the same. He was rewriting reports for his colleagues. They didn't ask. They didn't thank him. And they got angry when they found out because it felt like a reproach. Help that's forced on people isn't care. It's an attempt to feel needed. And feeling needed is his addiction, his drug, his way of not feeling empty. And here, in this new world with new hands and new strength, he was doing exactly the same thing. He was piling people with things they hadn't asked for so they would thank him. And for 5 minutes, he would stop feeling useless. Yun sat down next to him. She was silent. Then she said he wasn't useless, that he just didn't know how to stop, and that if he died of exhaustion in a month, there would be no one left to brew the potion. Dan asked what he should do. So-Yun said to show. Don't give it away. Show them. The next day, So-Yun walked out of the city gates with a blade coated in gray-blue paste. She was heading toward the northern forest. Dan wanted to go with her. She said that if he went outside the gates, she'd break his legs. He stayed. So-Yun returned 4 hours later. She was dragging a carcass over her shoulder, the size of a large wolf, gray-green, shapeless, with hollows where the eyes should be. A creature of rot, a small scout. She dropped the carcass in the middle of the square. There were traces of gray-green slime on the blade, but not a single new nick. The coating was working. People came out of their houses. They looked at the carcass. They looked at So-Yun. They looked at the sword. So-Yun said nothing. She silently wiped the blade. She silently walked to the workshop. She sat on the threshold and looked at Dan with a, "Well, what now?" expression. Now he understood. By evening, the first 5 people had come for the coating. The next day, 12. 3 days later, the entire city guard was lined up outside the workshop. 5 men, all 5 of them, with axes and spears that had previously been good for nothing more serious than a wild boar. Dan applied the coating himself, to every item, and the lines revealed more than just the metal to him. They revealed wear and tear, weak spots, vulnerabilities. Every weapon that passed through his hands he adjusted as he went, straightened, reinforced, tailored to the owner. A guard named got his axe back and was silent for a minute. Then he asked what Dan had done to the balance. Dan said he'd shifted the center of gravity 2 centimeters toward the butt because got strikes from his right shoulder and it's more comfortable that way. Got asked how Dan knew how he struck. Dan looked at his right hand. A callus at the base of his thumb, worn skin on the back of his palm, a habit of a wide, top-to-bottom swing. It wasn't magical vision. It was the gaze of a man who had spent 10 years handing out tools and knew by the hands how each person held them. Got left without a word, but that evening he brought Dan a piece of jerky and a mug of ale. He didn't say thank you. He just set it down and left. And that was better than any thank you. By the end of the 3rd week, Bren Hollow had changed, imperceptibly, not on the outside, from the inside. People stopped averting their eyes when they spoke of the rotten. The guards went out beyond the walls on patrols that hadn't happened in 3 years. Thorne was taking more orders at the smithy because people were repairing old weapons they'd previously considered beyond repair. The workshop was open every day. Abby had perfected the recipe for the 3rd time. 59%. Duration, 16 hours. She sat over the pot with the new mixture and smiled in a way Dan had never seen her smile before. Not sarcastically, not crookedly. Genuinely. Her knowledge was working. For the first time in 2 years, someone hadn't called it heresy. On the 22nd day, trouble arrived. Not rot. Worse. A letter. Thorne brought it from Bema's shop, sealed in wax with a coat of arms. The coat of arms of the Guild of Masters, the regional branch. The letter was addressed to the head of Bren Hollow. It stated that the guild had received information about an unregistered craftsman practicing without a rank or license, that this was a violation of the Master's Code, Article 14, Section 3, that in 10 days an inspector would arrive in Bren Hollow to conduct an inspection. Dan read the letter, and the lines before his eyes blurred. Not from the system, from his own hands. He knew that feeling. An audit, an inspection. The bosses are coming. In the warehouse, that meant 3 days without sleep, rearranging everything to meet standards, hiding what didn't fit in the report. Here, it meant the same thing. Only what was at stake wasn't a fine for misclassification. What was at stake was his freedom. Soyeon read the letter. She set it on the table. She placed her hand on her sword and said 2 words. Let him come. Abby read the letter. She turned pale. Then she blushed. Then she said the guild could shove its code up Thorne's ass. Hae-jin read the letter. She wrote 1 word on a tablet. Get ready. Dan looked at the 3 of them, at Thorna in the doorway, at Kay, who was peeking out from behind his father's back. And for the first time, he thought that the word team didn't mean those gathered for a single shift. A team is those who remain when the audit comes. 10 days. Dan organized this time like a warehouse shipment. He broke it down into tasks. He set priorities. The first 3 days, preparing the workshop. All materials sorted. All finished items accounted for. If the inspector comes looking for violations, he'll find an order that doesn't exist in any other smithy in Arkland. The next 3 days, stockpiling cover. If the workshop is shut down after the inspection, the city must have a 3-month supply. The remaining 4 days, working with people. The cover and the repaired weapons are already with the townspeople. The inspector won't be able to take them back, but he can ban Dan from working, and then the town will be left without a master. Abby suggested another plan. Run away. Gather what we can and head south, change towns, start over. Dan said no. So Yun said she agreed with Dan, and that if the inspector tries to arrest anyone, he'll take them out one by one. Dan said no to violence, too. If he so much as laid a finger on a guild representative, the whole of Bren Hollow would face sanctions. The city would lose its right to trade in brown iron. The mine would shut down. People would start starving. One inspector wouldn't solve the problem. There was a system behind him. Soyeon cursed and left to sharpen her sword. Dan sat at the table and thought. He'd survived 4 audits at the warehouse. All 4 times, the bosses had looked for violations they could pin on the rank and file, and all 4 times, Dan had survived in the same way. Documentation. Flawless. Boring. So detailed that it would be faster for the inspector to leave than to finish reading it. He began preparing the documents. In this world, they were called ledgers. Every master with a guild rank had a work register. What was done? From what? For whom? What recipe was used? Dan had no rank, but he could keep a register. Hei-jin had already kept half of it. Her notebook became the foundation. Dan added a detailed description of the materials to each entry. Source, condition, properties, processing method, result. He couldn't cite the system as the source of knowledge, but he could describe the process so that any blacksmith could replicate it if they wished. Abby joined in on the second day. She knew the format of the guild ledgers. She knew which words to use, which notes to make, how to format recipes so they looked legitimate. She dictated, Hegan wrote. Dan checked the facts through the system. 3 days, 80 pages of the register. Every job, every item, every material, accurate to the gram. Thorne looked at the finished registry and said that half of the 4th-rank masters had worse documentation. Dan worked in parallel. He couldn't stop. People came, with broken things, with requests, with hope in their eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. A woman with a sick husband brought old crutches, wooden, cracked. The tests showed there was still enough strength left in the wood. Dan reinforced them, adjusted them to his height, wrapped the handles in leather with anti-slip grooves. A farmer brought a broken plow. Hopeless, in Thorne's opinion. Dan saw that the main beam was intact, that the plowshare could be reassembled from the fragments, that the attachment to the harness needed to be shifted 4 centimeters to the left to fit the farmer's specific horse. He asked the farmer about the horse, height, chest width, habit of pulling with its left shoulder forward. The farmer looked at him as if he were crazy, but he answered. The plow was returned to him 3 hours later. The farmer harnessed the horse the next morning and plowed a furrow he hadn't been able to plow for 2 seasons. Because the plow finally ran smoothly. Because for the first time, someone had adjusted the tool not to fit horse, but to his horse. Every evening, Dan collapsed onto the cot and couldn't lift his arms. Every morning, he got up and went to the table. Hei-jin brought breakfast in silence. Soyeon checked the perimeter. Abby brewed potions. Routine. Warm. Real. On the 6th day 10, something happened that Dan hadn't expected. A woman entered the workshop. Tall, straight back, dark hair tucked under a simple scarf. Her clothes were expensive but worn, the kind of clothes that once cost a fortune but were now worn to shreds because there would be no new ones. The scans revealed a dress, top-quality fabric, silver thread in the lining, residual magical protection, 2%. A coat of arms on the inside of the cuff, the Vale family. Dan didn't know that name, but Thorne did. He stood in the doorway, and at the sight of the crest, his face froze. The woman introduced herself, Rosalind Vale. She said it as if she were waiting for a reaction, preparing for it. Her eyes were cold, her chin was raised, but her fingers were clenching the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Thorne said one word quietly. The Vales. Then he added that the Vale family was a dynasty of blacksmiths, one of the oldest in the region. Their family recipes were considered a national treasure. 7 generations of masters, the best weapons west of the capital, or so they were considered. Because 12 years ago, the Guild of Masters had bought the Vale family's recipes to settle their debts. Rosalind's father had gambled away his fortune and his health trying to compete with the Guild, and when he died, the debts passed to his daughter. The Guild offered a deal, the recipes in exchange for the debt being written off. Rosalind was 15. She had no choice. Now, she is 27. She has no workshop, no money, no recipes, just a title with no inheritance, and one thing in her bag. She took it out, placed it on the table. A knife, small, with a bone handle, darkened by time. The lines flashed, and Dan stopped breathing. The blade, wile steel, an alloy of unknown composition, magical conductivity 14 units per gram, condition 91%, age over 200 years. Available recipes. The lines ran down, but not assembly recipes. Recipes for the alloy itself. The system read the knife like a book. Every layer, every stage of forging, every additive, temperature regime, holding time, sequence of strikes. It wasn't a knife. It was an instruction manual. The complete recipe for Vale steel encoded in the finished product. Rosalind said it was the only thing she had hidden from the Guild. Her great-great-grandmother's knife. Useless as a weapon, but the last piece of her heritage. She had heard of a master from Bren Hollow who could see the essence of things. She came to find out if it was true. Dan stared silently at the lines. Then he lifted his head and looked at Rosalind. At her cold eyes, behind which something fragile, something. At her fingers, which still clutched the strap of her bag. At her straight back, which didn't bend because if it did, it would break. He said that the complete recipe for her family's steel was inscribed in this knife, that he could read it, restore it, write it down, give her back what the Guild had taken. Rosalind didn't move. For a second. 2. 5. Then her chin twitched. Once. She clenched her jaw and didn't let it twitch again. She asked how much. Dan said it was free. So-Yeon behind him sighed but said nothing. Rosalind said she didn't believe in free. Dan said it wasn't free, that when he creates a recipe, he'll need someone who knows how to forge it, because the system shows how, but the master's hands aren't his hands. A Vale recipe requires a Vale blacksmith. Rosalind looked at him, then at the knife, then at Dan, and said she wasn't a blacksmith, that she'd never stood at a forge, that she knew the recipes only in theory because her father hadn't had time to teach her in practice. Dan said that practice was a matter of time, and that a lost recipe was a matter of a single knife and a couple of hours. She stayed. She took a spot by the wall, silently, with her back straight, with the knife in her hands. So-yeon looked at her and said there was definitely no more room in the shed. Abby said the workshop wasn't a shed. Hae-jin brought a sign. "Welcome." Rosalind read the sign. She looked at Hae-jin, and for the first time all day, she unclasped her fingers from the strap of her bag. There were 4 days left until the inspection. Dan worked on the knife at night. The lines unfolded slowly. The Veil steel recipe was complex. 14 stages, 3 types of ore, 2 temperature regimes, and an ingredient he'd never encountered before. Moon dust. Not the moon salt Abby wore. Real dust from the surface of rocks that fell during a full moon. The system suggested a substitute. Quartz dust exposed to moonlight for 12 hours. 74% as effective as the original. Not ideal, but enough for the recipe to work. Dan wrote down every step, on paper, in ink. Hae-jin's hand was steadier. She wrote as he dictated, page by page. The Veil family's recipe, complete. Reconstructed from a single knife. Rosalind read each page as it was finished. Her hands were shaking. She didn't hide it. On the 3rd night of work, she said quietly that she had carried that knife for 12 years as a memento, and that it turned out to be more than a memento. Dan nodded. He knew that feeling. When something you consider useless turns out to be the most valuable thing you have. The inspector arrived on the 9th day, a day earlier than promised. Dan knew it by the sound, the clatter of hooves on the main road. Not a trade caravan. A single horse, well shod. The lines revealed the horseshoes even before the rider came into view. Star iron. Condition 98%. Magical conductivity 11 units. Star iron horseshoes. Even the guild's horse was worth more than the entire town. The rider dismounted near the square, of average height, stocky, a black traveling cloak with a silver clasp shaped like a hammer and anvil, the symbol of the Guild of Masters. Runes covered him from head to toe. The cloak, magically imbued fabric. The clasp, 3rd grade silver. Boots, griffin leather. Gloves, heat-insulated leather. Every item he wore was worth more than what Bren Hollow earned in a season. But Dan wasn't looking at the clothes. He was looking at the man. A calm face, attentive eyes, a neat beard with gray streaks, hands in gloves, but his movements gave him away. A blacksmith. Former or current. The habit of holding a hammer in his right hand, a callus at the base of his index finger, visible even through the glove's leather. This was no bureaucrat. This was a master craftsman who had become a bureaucrat, or who had been made an official. There is a difference. The man introduced himself to the village head, Bem, in the square. Master Hollis Grave, head of the regional branch of the Guild of Masters. Not an inspector. The head. Bem turned pale. Thorn, standing in the smithy doorway, clenched his jaw. So-yeon placed her hand on her sword. Dan told her quietly not to. She looked at him. She took her hand away, but she stayed close. Grave didn't go to the workshop right away. He walked through the town. He went into houses. He talked to people. Calmly, politely, without threats. He asked about the wandering master, what he does, how he does it, what he uses. People answered, some willingly, some warily. A Got guard showed his axe. A woman with pots showed her pots. A farmer talked about his plow. Grave listened, nodded, jotted things down in a small notebook. His face didn't change, not once. No surprise, no anger, no admiration. A professional mask. By noon, he had arrived at the workshop. Dan was waiting for him at the table. The register lay open on the first page. Abby and Rosalind stood nearby. Hajin sat in the corner with a notebook. So-Yun stood by the door. Thorne stood at the threshold of the smithy across the street and pretended to be working. Grave entered. He stopped. He surveyed the workshop, slowly. The table, the shelves, the tools, the coated plates, the blanks, scraps of material. The lines before Dan's eyes showed how Grave's gaze lingered on the coating, on the blanks, on the ledger. Grave took off his gloves, placed them on the table, ran his finger over the surface, looked at his finger. Clean. He picked up the ledger, opened it, began to read. He read for 40 minutes. Dan stood and waited. So-Yun stood and waited. Abby stood there biting her lip. Rosalind stood there not moving at all. Hajin was writing something in her notebook. Grave closed the register. He placed it on the table. He looked at Dan, and he spoke. He said the register was flawless, that the documentation was at the level of a third-rank master, that the description of materials and processes was more precise than that of most guild blacksmiths. Then he asked where Dan had been trained. Dan said nowhere. Grave asked who his mentor was. Dan said no one. Grave asked how he determined the properties of materials. Dan said he could see them. Grave was silent. Then he asked to see. He took a small object from his belt. He placed it on the table. A metal cylinder the size of a finger. The lines unfolded. A test sample from the Guild of Masters. An alloy. 7 components. Iron, 40%. Copper, 20%. Tin, 15%. Zinc, 10%. Silver, 8%. Carbon, 5%. A magical catalyst of unknown type, 2%. Magical conductivity, 9 units. Available recipes, 347. Dan recited the composition aloud. All 7 components, with percentages, accurate to the nearest unit. Grave didn't move. Then he pulled a notebook out of his pocket, opened it to a bookmarked page, checked it, closed it. His face remained unchanged, but Dan saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. Once. Grave asked about the coating. Dan showed him the vial, explained the composition, explained the principle, explained the effectiveness. 59% resistance to rot from materials costing nothing. Grave listened. Then he took the vial, opened it, sniffed it, dipped his finger in, rubbed it between his fingers, set the vial down on the table. And for the first time, his expression changed. Not surprise, not anger. Sadness. Quiet. Deep. Like that of a man who had seen confirmation of what he feared most. He said the coating worked, that he could tell by the composition, that the formula was simple and brilliant at the same time, and that was exactly why it was dangerous. Dan asked, "Dangerous to whom?" Grave replied, "To the system." He spoke calmly, without drama, like a man explaining the obvious to someone who doesn't want to hear it. He said that Arkland was held together by the system, that the system was imperfect, that the guild's monopoly is not about justice, but control. But control is order, and order is the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. If the recipe for making a coating from trash gets out into the world, the Alchemist's Guild will lose a third of its income. If Dan's method for reading materials becomes known, the entire system of ranks and patents will collapse. And if the system collapses, there be anyone to control quality. There will be no standards. There will be no guarantees. Any charlatan will start selling junk disguised as artifacts, and people will die from substandard weapons more often than from rot. Dan listened, and he understood. Grave wasn't a villain. Grave was the head of quality control, a man who believed that without rules, the world would fall apart. and he was right. Partly. There were rules in the warehouse too, and they were necessary too. But rules that forbid a storekeeper from moving a pallet so that a loader can work more comfortably, those aren't rules anymore. They're a cage. Dan told Grave that the people in Olma didn't die from a lack of order, but because that order sent all the good weapons to the capital and left the village with pitchforks. Grave remained silent. Then he said he would take the register to study it, that he would return in a month, that until his return, the workshop could operate, but without selling outside the city, and that Dan should think about registering with the guild, because he wouldn't like the alternative to registration. He took the register, put on his gloves, went out, mounted his horse, rode away. So-Yun exhaled first. Abby sat down in a chair and dropped her head into her hands. Rosalind stood motionless. Jin wrote on a sign. He'll be back. Dan knew it. An audit never ends with the first visit. The first visit is reconnaissance. Grave didn't come to shut down the workshop. He came to understand what he was dealing with. And now he understood. Dan stood in the middle of the workshop and thought. A month. He had a month. 30 days to make the workshop so essential to the city that closing it would be political suicide. 30 days to show that the order of the guilds and the freedom of the craftsmen were not mutually exclusive. 30 days to prove that trash isn't chaos. Trash is a resource that people simply don't see. The month began with rain, 3 days straight. The workshop roof held up. The quartz tiles proved their worth. But the roads were washed out, and the city seemed to shrink. People stayed home. Dan sat at the table working on the Vale steel recipe. Rosalind sat across from him, watching him write. She asked questions, not like Abby, not 100 a night. One at a time, precise, well-considered. Every question hit a weak spot in the formula, the exact point where the system had suggested replacing the original ingredient. Rosalind couldn't see the lines, but she knew the theory. Her father had managed to pass on his knowledge, if not his skills, and she sensed where the formula was flawed. Quartz grit instead of moon dust, 74% of the original. Rosalind asked what if, instead of the crumbs, they used quartz sand from the riverbank. The grain structure is different there. The system updated the calculation, 79%. Rosalind raised an eyebrow. She asked what if they exposed the sand not just to moonlight, but to moonlight reflected off water. The system recalculated, 83%. Dan looked at Rosalind. She couldn't see the code, but she thought like the system. Or perhaps the system thought like the Vales. 7 generations of blacksmiths had imbued the family recipes with such logic that even a fragment of their knowledge in the mind of the last heiress worked more accurately than Dan's complete. They worked together for 5 nights. By the 6th night, the recipe was complete. The Vales steel. A reconstructed version. 83% of the original. 14 stages. Detailed instructions. Dan placed a stack of sheets in front of Rosalind. She picked up the top one, read it, picked up the second, the third. Her eyes moved across the lines, and Dan could see something changing in them. Not joy, recognition. Like a person who has returned to the house where they grew up and sees familiar walls. She said she recognized her father's handwriting in the logic of the recipe, that he had explained the 3rd step to her when she was 9, that she had seen the 5th once through a crack in the workshop door when she was forbidden to enter, that she didn't know the 11th at all, and that it was beautiful. Then she laid the sheets on the table. She straightened the stack and said that now she needed a forge. Thorne gave her access to the smithy. Not right away. First, he stood there for an hour listening to Rosalind talk about the 3rd stage of hardening. Then he silently opened the door. Rosalind stood at the forge for the first time in her life at 27. Her hands didn't know the hammer, but her head knew everything. Dan stood beside her. The system displayed the metal's temperature, the angle of impact, force. He couldn't send her the lines, but he could speak. A little to the left, harder. Wait 2 seconds. Now. They worked like two people at a single forge. She struck, he guided. The first piece came out crooked. The second was better. The third already resembled what the lines showed. The fourth. Rosalind lifted it with pliers and held it up to the light. A strip of metal, dark, with a bluish tint. The readings confirmed it. Veil steel. Quality 71% of the standard. Magical conductivity 10 units. Not 14 like her great-great-grandmother's knife, but 10. From river sand and brown iron from the Bren Hollow mine. Rosalind held the strip and her hands were shaking. Thorne stood by the wall and said nothing. His eyes were wet. He turned away, blowed his nose, said it was a draft. That night, Rosalind didn't sleep. She sat at the table in the workshop and wrote. Her notes, her additions to the recipe, her ideas. Dan saw her writing and understood. He hadn't given her back the thing. He'd given her back her name. Between working with Rosalind, Dan didn't forget about the city. A month until G's return, Riva. Every day counted. He changed his approach. He stopped giving things away for free, not because he had become greedy, because So-Yun was right. You don't appreciate something you get for free. He introduced a trade-off. Need a repair? Bring materials. Anything. Trash, junk, whatever's lying around underfoot. A stone, a twig, a shard. Dan assessed the materials. If they had enough properties for the job, he put them to use. People brought trash and got things in return, not for free, in exchange for the material. Formally, it was a trade. In fact, Dan was turning nothing into something of value. But what mattered to people was that they weren't begging, that they were contributing their share, that it was fair. The system worked. By mid-month, 15 people a day were coming to the workshop. Dan couldn't handle it alone. Abby took over the coding. She could make it without the system. Dan gave her the exact recipe, and she memorized it on the first try. Rosalind began doing simple repairs, straightening, sharpening, fitting. Without the system, but with hands that learned quickly and a mind that understood metal at a visceral level. Hajin handled the reception. She took orders, she sorted materials, she organized the queue. Her signs became the language of the workshop. People learned to read them. Wait. Ready. Bring it tomorrow. Need different material. The small, mute girl became the voice of the workshop, and no one saw the irony in it, because no one thought about it. So-Yun went hunting every other day. There were more rotten beasts in the northern forest. Not large ones, small scouts, but their numbers were growing. So-Yun returned with carcasses and laid them out in the square. Before, a single carcass would terrify the whole town. Now, 3 carcasses a week were just a topic of conversation at dinner. Habituation. People were getting used to it. It was both good and dangerous. On the 20th day of the month, the 6th one arrived in Bren Hollow. Mina, a traveling peddler with a cart full of junk. Short, black-haired, with a smile that never left her face, even when she haggled down to the last penny. She came to sell and saw the workshop. She stood at the entrance for half an hour, watching. Then she went inside. She looked at the shelves, at the blanks, at the line of people, at Dan, and said his logistics were terrible. Dan looked at her. She was right. The workshop was running, but chaotically. Orders were taken without a system of priorities. Materials were stored haphazardly. Finished items lay mixed in with the blanks. Jin kept track of inventory, but inventory isn't logistics. Inventory is knowing what you have. Logistics is knowing what goes where and when. Mina proposed a deal. She would streamline the process. She would organize order intake. She would prioritize orders by urgency. She would organize storage. She would start selling surplus fabric to traveling merchants. In return, she would receive 10% of the revenue and a spot for her cart. Dan said they had no revenue. Mina said they would have some in a week. So-yeon said she didn't trust the merchants. Mina said she was right. Abby said she didn't care as long as no one touched her ingredients. Rosalind said logistics were really necessary. Jin wrote on a sign, "Let her try." Mina stayed, and 3 days later, the workshop had changed. Not on the inside, on the outside. Mina put up a bulletin board, appointment schedule, a list of what the workshop could do, a price list in materials, not money. The line stopped crowding at the door. People came at their appointed times. They brought the necessary materials. They picked up the finished items. Mina knew every merchant on every route within a 5-day journey. She sold the first batch of roofing to a passing caravan for salt and dried meat and 2 pieces of good fabric. So-yeon said Mina was dangerous. Dan said that was exactly what was needed. By the 25th day, the From Nothing workshop had become the center of Bren Hollow. Not officially. In fact, people came not just for things. They came to talk. To sit on the bench Dan had built at the entrance. To drink water from the jug that was always there because Jin filled it every morning. The small town was developing habits that hadn't existed a month ago. And in the middle of it all stood Dan. Tired, with aching hands, with eyes from which the lines wouldn't fade even in his sleep. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about whether he was needed, but about how not to let down those who had decided he was. On the 28th day, So-yeon returned from the hunt earlier than usual, without her makeup. Dan saw her face and realized that something was wrong. She walked into the workshop, closed the door, looked at everyone, and said there were no more small creatures in the forest. Abby asked what none meant. So-yeon said the small scouts had left, all of them, overnight. The forest was empty, silent. No tracks, no scent, nothing. And that's bad. Because scouts only leave in one case, when something big is coming. Thorn stood in the doorway and his face turned gray. He said it was the same in Ulma. First, the small ones disappeared. 3 days later, a full-sized creature arrived. 3 days. They had 3 days, maybe less. Dan stood up from the table. The lines before his eyes were blurring. He looked at the workshop, at the shelves, at the materials, at the people. Then he closed his eyes, opened them. The lines lined up like columns in a warehouse inventory. He began to count. Enough coating for 87 portions. That would be enough for all the weapons in the city, with some left over. Weapons. 5 guards with axes and spears. So-yeon with a blade. Thorn with a blacksmith's hammer. 12 men capable of wielding weapons. 3 women who know how to shoot a bow. 22 fighters. Against the beast that devoured the village. Not enough. Catastrophically not enough. But that's not the only resource. The trash heap behind the smithy, supplies in the workshop, scraps from a month's work, river sand, stones, willow bark, clay, leather, wood, ropes. Lists spread out over everything within a 100-meter radius. Thousands of items, thousands of recipes. Dan turned to the team. So-yeon, Abby, Rosalind, Hyejin, Mina, Thorn in the doorway, Kai behind his father. He said he needed to know every person who would fight, not by name, by their hands, by their grip, by their height, by their habits, by an old wound, by their fear, by everything that makes a person exactly that person, and not just an abstract fighter. So-Yun nodded. An hour later, all 22 defenders of Bren Hollow were standing in the workshop courtyard. Dan stepped out to meet them. The lines revealed more than just the equipment they wore. They revealed the people. Gott, the guard, right-handed, wide swing, strength in the shoulders, weak knees, an old fracture in the left shin, afraid of low blows. He needs an axe with a long handle to keep his distance, and a shin guard on his left leg. Mara, the archer, left-handed, good eye, pulls the bowstring to her cheekbone, not her ear. Means she shoots offhand. She needs arrows with weighted tips for stability at close range, and a wrist guard for his right hand because the bowstring hits it every fifth shot. Nico, the farmer, never held a weapon, but his hands are like shovels, used to pitchforks. He doesn't need a sword. He needs a spear with a wide blade that works like a pitchfork. A familiar motion, a familiar grip. In war, it's not the best, but the weapon you don't have to think about. Dan walked along the row and watched. At everyone. Into everyone. The lines told him what people didn't say out loud. The tremor in their hands, old scars, the tilt of their torso, the width of their stance. Every person was a problem. An equation that has a solution if you know all the variables. He returned to the workshop and began working. So-Yun stood at the door. She said not to let anyone in. Abby was preparing the coating. Rosalind helped Thorne in the forge. Mina counted the supplies and distributed the materials. Heijin kept track of everything and carried water and tools and food and whatever was needed at any given moment, because she saw it before anyone asked. Dan worked. The system guided his hands. Lines burned before his eyes. He wasn't making weapons. He was making weapons for specific people. A shin guard for Gott, from scraps of leather with metal plates made from flattened horseshoes, a perfect fit for his leg. Protection specifically for his left shin, right where the old fracture was. Arrows for Mara, from straight ash branches with tips of forged copper, heavy lead drops from an old sinker, balanced for her shooting style, offhand, short range. A spear for Nico, made from the handle of a broken plow, with a blade forged by Thorne based on Dan's design. Wide, like a pitchfork, with a fork at the end that allowed not only striking, but also hooking. A familiar motion for hands that had been turning hay for 20 years. 22 people, 22 sets, each assembled for a specific person, for his body, for his fear, for his strength and weakness. Dan worked all night, then all day, then again, but again. The system guided him like a GPS guides a car. Turn, strike, bend, cut, connect. But the GPS doesn't sense the driver's fatigue, and the system didn't sense that Dan had lost sight in his right eye from exhaustion, that his fingers wouldn't straighten, that he'd fallen off his chair twice and only got back up because Heijin happened to be nearby each time. On the second night, So-Yun walked into the workshop. She stood in front of the table. She took the workpiece from his hands. Dan looked up. His eyes were red, his face was gray. She told him he was going to bed right now. Dan said he wasn't finished. There were 6 sets left. So-Yun said that 6 sets wouldn't help if the master passed out and couldn't explain how to use them. Dan wanted to object, but his legs gave way. So-Yun caught him by the shoulder. She led him to the topchan. She laid him down. He passed out before his head touched the pillow. He woke up 4 hours later. Heijin was sitting next to him on the floor. She hadn't slept. She was keeping watch. In front of her lay a sign that read, 2 more hours. Dan shook his head. He stood up. Staggering, he made his way to the table and finished. 6 sets in 3 hours. By the time he hammered the last pin into the mount of the final cuff, the sun was already rising. So-Yun, Thorn, and Rosalind were standing in the doorway. Abby was asleep in a chair in the corner. 22 stacks of gear lay on the table. Each had a sign on which He-Jin had written the owner's name. Dan looked at it all and began to shake. Not from the cold, not from exhaustion, from the realization that he had done everything he could, and that it might not be enough. He turned to So-Yun. He asked when. So-Yun looked north. Outside the workshop window, the sky was gray-green from horizon to horizon, not a narrow strip like on the first night, a solid wall. She said, "Today." The creature emerged from the forest at dawn. Dan was standing on the workshop roof and saw it first, not because he had good eyesight, because the lines appeared before the silhouette, a kilometer away. The lines stared him in the face like a solid wall. Organic mass, state unstable, component, absorbed wood 40%, component, absorbed earth 25%, component, absorbed flesh of undetermined origin 20%, component, magical binding agent of unknown type 15%, magical conductivity, chaotic, fluctuations from 0 to 200 units, available recipes, error, structure unreadable. The system could not read the creature as an object, because the creature was not an object. It was a process, unfinished, formless, alive. The size of a 3-story house, a gray-green mass that moved slowly, like dough spilling over the edge of a pot. Only this dough devoured everything in its path. Trees, bushes, rocks, the fence on the outskirts. Everything sank into the gray-green surface and vanished. Without a sound, without a splash, it simply sank in and became part of the mass. Dan climbed down from the roof. His hands were shaking. His legs felt like cotton after 2 days without sleep. But the stitches burned evenly, and that was the only thing keeping him on his feet. So-Yun was already lining up the people against the northern wall. There was no wall as such, just a wooden fence as tall as a man. But the people were standing along it, and that provided at least some sort of reference point. 22 defenders. In the gear Dan had made for each of them. Gott stood with a long-handled axe and a greave on his left leg. His face was stony, but his hands didn't tremble. Familiar weight, familiar balance, a weapon made for him. Mara stood slightly behind him with a bow and a quiver of heavy arrows. Nico stood with a spear fork and looked strangely calm for a man who had never fought. His hands remembered the movements. The rest didn't matter. So-Yun walked along the line, briefly, clearly. Not a pre-battle speech. Instructions. Don't engage in close combat. Strike and retreat. Archers operate from the rear. Spearmen hold the line. Swordsmen cover the flanks. If the creature breaks through the line, everyone retreats to the workshop. Why to the workshop? Because Dan would be there. Dan wasn't standing in the ranks. He was standing at the entrance to the workshop with a bag of tools and 3 flasks of coating. His role was different, not to strike, not to defend, to repair, during the battle. The coating lasts 16 hours, but upon contact with the creature, it wore off faster. Every blow against the rotten one stripped away a layer. 10 blows, and the blade was bare. Dan had to reapply the coating, right in the heat of battle, on the fly. A fighter strikes, steps back to Dan. Dan coats the blade. The fighter returns to the line. An assembly line, just like in a warehouse. Goods arrive, goods are processed, goods are shipped. Only here, the goods are people, and processing is the difference between life and death. The creature reached the fence at 7 in the morning. The fence didn't slow it down. The tree sank into the gray-green mass and vanished. The lines updated. The creature had devoured the fence. New component, processed wood 0.3%. It was growing from what it ate. Su-Yun struck first. The coated star iron blade entered the mass and the creature twitched. For the first time since it began moving, it twitched. Like a person pricked by a needle. The coating was working. The sword didn't dull. Su-Yun struck quickly and precisely. Each strike severed chunks of the gray-green mass that fell to the ground and twitched like fish on the shore. But the creature didn't stop. The pieces grew back. Within seconds, it regenerated faster than a single person could chop. Mara's arrows pierced the mass and got stuck. The weighted tips acted like anchors. The creature twitched at the points of impact. It slowed down. For a second. Nico jabbed with his fork spear, hooked the edge of the mass, pulled, teared off a chunk the size of a dog. The chunk fell and twitched. Nico stepped on it and jabbed again. His hands did what they'd been doing for 20 years. Hook, lift, throw. Only instead of hay, it was rot. The fight lasted 2 hours. Dan didn't remember it as a single whole. He remembered fragments. So-Yun at his table, the blade gray with slime, the coating worn away. Dan smears fresh paste on the blade. His hands move automatically. So-Yun leaves, returns 10 minutes later. Again. Got an uncoated axe. Dan applies the paste. Got leaves. Then Nico comes in with a spear shaft that's cracked. Dan repairs it right on his knees. The stitches show where the crack is. He wraps it with a leather cord. He drives in a pin. 4 minutes. Nico leaves. Then one of the archers. The bowstring snapped. Dan puts on a new one from the supply. Then Mara. Her arm guard is torn. Dan patches it up on the fly. An assembly line. An endless assembly line. Take it, fix it, send it. Take it, fix it, send it. The creature was crawling toward the city center, slowly. The fighters slowed it down, but they didn't stop it. It swallowed 3 houses on the outskirts, 4, the fence around the vegetable garden, an old well. Every object it swallowed added to its mass. The lines updated continuously. The creature's size increased by 12%. 15, 18. By the end of the second hour, the creature was twice as big as at the start. The men were exhausted. Dan could tell by the lines on their gear. Wear and tear, deformation, micro cracks. The weapons held up, the coating worked. But the men were at their limit. Gott was limping. An old fracture had flared up. The shin guarded the bone, but the muscles around it were cramping from the strain. 2 gunmen retreated with cuts. The creature was shooting out tendrils, thin, fast, like whips. One hit Nico on the shoulder. The leather shoulder pad held up, but Nico fell, got up, turned pale, and kept going. Dan stood by the workshop, and he was shaking. Not from fear, from helplessness. He could repair. He could patch things up. But he couldn't stop this creature. His weapons worked, his gear held up, his coating gave people the ability to fight. But the creature was growing. It was devouring the city and growing. And no amount of coating could solve this problem. Lines flickered before his eyes. He looked at the creature, at a shapeless mass, at chaotic readings of magical conductivity, at the note, structure unreadable. And suddenly one line flashed, not a reading, not a formula, a notification. Repeating structure detected, depth 7 meters, source of instability. Dan blinked. The line didn't disappear. Repeating structure. Inside the chaotic mass was something orderly, something that had structure, like a part inside a pile of trash, like a barcode under a layer of dirt. The system couldn't read the creature in its entirety, but it found something inside it that could be read, something that had been made, crafted, by someone once upon a time, and abandoned, unfinished. Dan ran, not away from the creature, toward the creature. So-Yun saw him. She screamed, but he didn't hear her. The lines led him, like markings on the floor lead to the right shelf. Straight ahead, 20 meters. To the left, 10. Here. He stopped 5 meters from the edge of the mass. The creature moved toward him. Slowly. A tentacle reached toward his leg. So-Yun appeared beside him. She chopped off the tendril. She grabbed Dan by the collar. She dragged him back. Dan told her to stop. He said he could see something inside, that there was a structure at the center of this mass, something assembled, something that could be taken apart. So-Yun asked how he planned to get to the center. Dan looked at the creature, at the seams, at his own hands, and realized he wasn't going to get to the center. He was going to take the creature apart from the outside, layer by layer, like removing packaging from a pallet. A system, reconstruction and disassembly. He could read any finished object down to its recipe and break it back down into components. The rotten creature wasn't a finished object. It was an unfinished craft. But it had a structure, even if deep, even if distorted, even if chaotic. But a structure. And that meant it had components. And that meant it could be taken apart. Not all of it, not right away, but to start. Dan reached out toward the edge of the mass. Lines flashed. Component. Absorbed wood. Separate. Yes. No. He chose yes, and a fist-sized chunk of the mass broke apart. Splinters fell to the ground, ordinary wooden splinters, wet, gray, but wooden. The creature twitched, as if in pain. Dan separated another piece, absorbed earth. A handful of dirt fell to the ground. Another piece, another. It was slow, painfully slow. Each separation required concentration. The lines flickered on the verge of legibility. The creature resisted. Its mass tried to pull back what Dan was separating, but he didn't stop. So-Yun stood nearby. She chopped off the tendrils reaching toward him. Her blade whistled through the air every 3 seconds. Dan dismantled. She defended. 2 hours. 3. Dan wasn't counting. He saw only lines, only components, only the pallet that needed to be dismantled, box by box. The creature was shrinking. Slowly, but noticeably. The people saw it. Gott saw it and yelled something. Nico saw it and struck with redoubled force. Mara saw it and began firing faster. The creature was shrinking. The fighters hacked away from the outside. Dan was dismantling it from the inside. And somewhere between the 4th and 5th hour of the battle, the lines finally reached the center. Repetitive structure. Depth 0.5 meters. Component. Magical binding agent. Type. Artificial. Origin. Craft. Author. Unknown. Status. Unfinished. Error in the recipe. Step 7 of 12 contains a critical deformation. Recipe interrupted. Process continues autonomously. Absorption of matter is an attempt at self-completion. Dan read the lines, and the world around him fell silent. He stood 5 meters from the center of the creature that had devoured half the city. People were screaming all around him. So-Yun's sword whistled, and arrows whizzed by. And he read. The recipe. An unfinished recipe. Rot is not an element, not a curse, not a disease. It is someone's craft. Someone began to create something, made a mistake on the seventh step, gave up. And the unfinished process crept on its own, devouring matter, trying to finish itself. Millions of tons of earth and wood and flesh, villages and cities and forests. All of it was building material for a thing that someone hadn't finished. Dan stretched both hands toward the center of mass. The system. Deconstruction. The magical binding agent. Separate. He pulled, and the world flashed. Not with light. Lines. Thousands of lines. Tens of thousands. The recipe flooded his eyes like a stream of data from a hacked database. Every step, every ingredient, every parameter. 12 steps of a recipe that someone had written for something enormous, for something that was supposed to change the world. Literally. Dan screamed. He couldn't hear his own scream. The lines had jammed all channels of perception. He saw only data, only the recipe, only a stranger's handwriting in the structure of the commands. Handwriting that resembled his own. Not in the details, in the logic. Someone thought like him, saw the world as a set of components, assembled a whole from them. Only this someone didn't work with nails and roof tiles. This someone worked with continents. And made a mistake. The thing fell apart. It didn't explode. It didn't melt. It fell apart. Just like a building set falls apart when you remove a key piece. The gray-green mass settled, spread out, turned into a pile of wet earth and splinters and dirt. Ordinary dirt. Without magic. Without conductivity. Without lines. A square. A street. The ruins of 4 houses. Mud up to his knees. And silence. Dan stood in the middle of that silence. His eyes were open, but he saw nothing. The lines before his eyes faded for the first time since he'd awakened in this world. Darkness. Then light. Then the lines returned, slowly, dimly, like a computer screen after a reboot. He looked at his hands. Dirty, gray with slime, shaking. His knees buckled. He fell. So-Yun caught him. She set him down on the ground. Her face was covered in mud and cuts. Her eyes were huge. She was asking something. Dan couldn't hear her. He was looking up at the sky. 2 moons were fading in the morning light. The gray-green wall on the horizon was gone. Not across the entire horizon, but where the creature had stood, the sky had cleared. A narrow strip of normal sky in the midst of the sick one. Dan closed his eyes and said 2 words, accepted into storage, and passed out. Dan slept for 3 days. When he opened his eyes, the lines were back, but they looked different, dull, fainter, like text on a screen with a dead battery. He was lying on a cot in the workshop. Hedgen was sitting on a chair nearby. She was asleep. Her head was tilted to one side. A sign was clenched in her hands. The sign read, "Don't get up until I tell you." Dan didn't get up. Not because he obeyed, because he couldn't. His body wouldn't listen. His hands felt like someone else's. His fingers wouldn't bend. The muscles from his wrists to his shoulders burned with a dull, aching pain. He turned his head. The workshop looked different, cleaner. The shelves had been rearranged. The tools were laid out in their places. There was a stack of papers on the table. Next to it were 3 clay bowls with a new kind of glaze, greenish, not gray-blue. Abby. The door opened. So-Yun came in. She saw that Dan wasn't asleep. She stopped. She looked at him.
Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and said that if he ever ran toward that creature with his bare hands again, she would break both his legs, then both his arms. Then she would tie him to the bed. Dan wanted to smile, but his face wouldn't cooperate. He asked what had happened to the town. So-yeon told him. 4 houses destroyed, no casualties. 7 wounded, none seriously. The cover and equipment worked. People fought and didn't lose a single man against the creature that devoured the village of Ulm entirely. It was impossible, and it happened. Dan asked what happened after he passed out. So-yeon said he fell and stopped breathing for 4 seconds, that Claire had revived him. Dan asked who Claire was. So-yeon said she was a healer. She had come from the northern monastery 2 days before the battle, a refugee. The monastery had been destroyed by the rot. She was the sole survivor. She was heading south. She made it to Bren Hollow. She stayed to help the wounded after the battle. Dan met her later. 2 days later, when he was able to stand, a tall woman with a calm face and hands that moved precisely and gently. Her voice was soft. Her eyes were warm. But inside, there was something hard, like a steel rod wrapped in cloth. She examined him, said his body was on the brink, that his arm muscles were damaged from overexertion, that his eyes were inflamed, that he'd lost 4 kilograms in a week, that if he kept working at this pace, in a month, his arms would stop functioning. Forever. Dan listened, and the lines before his eyes confirmed every word. Forearm muscle tissue, condition 34%, multiple micro-tears. Recommendation, rest for 14 days. His own hands had become an entry in a catalog, and that entry was flashing red. Claire stayed in Bren Hollow, not for Dan's sake, for the people's sake. 7 wounded after the battle. 3 townspeople with chronic illnesses that no one could treat. Children with winter colds. A town without a doctor. Claire took a room in Mayor Bema's house and saw patients every day. She didn't talk about the monastery, didn't talk about the rotten, didn't talk about what she had seen. Only once did Dan notice her looking north, at the gray-green sky, and her hands, which were always steady, were trembling. While Dan lay there, the world around him didn't wait. News of the battle for Bren Hollow spread along the trade routes faster than Dan could get back on his feet. Mina tried. No, Mina didn't try. Mina worked. She sent 3 letters with the very first caravan, 1 to a trading partner in the south, 1 to an acquaintance in the county seat, 1 to a mercenary she knew from her past life. The content of all 3 was the same. The town of Bren Hollow had repelled a full-sized rotten creature without a single casualty, with weapons made from trash. When Jan found out about the letters and came to Mina, she said that Mina was setting Dan up, that the fame would attract not only merchants, but also the guild, slave traders, and nobles. Mina replied that the fame was already spreading, that the caravan driver who witnessed the battle would tell everyone at every inn from Bren Hollow to the capital that it was impossible to stop, that one could only control it, and that it was better for people to hear the story from Mina than from a random eyewitness who would distort half of it. So, Jan hated this logic, but she couldn't argue with it. Dan, meanwhile, was thinking about something else, about the recipe, about the 12 steps he had seen at the creature's core. The lines had recorded everything. The system had saved the data as a file in memory. He could retrieve it at any moment. 12 steps, 7 completed, 1 with a critical error, 4 not started. A recipe for what? The system didn't know, or couldn't say. There was no description of the goal, only steps, only ingredients, only parameters. Like instructions without a product name.
put this together, but we won't tell you what it is." Dan lay on the cot and ran the lines through his head. Step 1. Gathering basic materials. Earth, stone, water, wood, metal, scale, continental. Someone was gathering materials on a continental scale. Step 2. Structuring. Creating connections between materials, forming a network that permeates the earth like the roots of a tree. Step 3. Saturation with magical energy, infusing power into the network. Step 4. Awakening. The network begins to operate autonomously. Step 5. Adjustment. Calibrating the flows. Step 6. Stabilization. Locking in the parameters. Step 7. Error. Critical deformation. Process interrupted. Step 8 and beyond. Not started. Dan read this and a chill ran through him. Someone had crafted a world. Not an object, not a weapon, not an artifact. A world. Or something on a global scale. A network that permeates the earth. A network that operates autonomously. A network that, after an error in Step 7, began to absorb the matter around it, trying to finish what had not been completed. Rottenness isn't an enemy. Rottenness is a manufacturing defect, a bug in the program, a glitch in the assembly line. And Dan's system, his menu of nothing, his vision of materials, his recipes, all of this was part of the same tool, a fragment, as if someone had broken a hammer and one shard had become an independent object. His ability and rot were pieces of a single whole. He told the team about it, in the evening, when everyone gathered in the workshop. So-yeon listened and remained silent. Abby listened and asked questions. Rosalind listened and turned pale. Hae-jin listened and took notes. Mina listened and counted something on her fingers. Claire sat by the wall and listened. Thorne stood in the doorway and listened. When Dan finished, the silence was so thick you could hear the candle crackling. Abby spoke first. She said that if rot was an unfinished craft, then it could be finished, or taken apart. Dan nodded. Theoretically, yes. In practice, to do that, you'd have to get to the source, to the place where the craft began, to the first step, to the point where the network originated. So-yeon asked where that was. Dan looked north, where the gray-green sky was thickest. There, to the north, far away. So-yeon nodded, as if she'd known all along, as if she'd been waiting for this since day one. She stood up, placed her hand on her sword, and said that then they needed to get ready. Preparing for the expedition took 2 months. Dan wasn't in a hurry. His hands hadn't fully healed yet. Claire forbade him from crafting for more than 4 hours a day. He argued. She looked at him calmly and said that a dead master wouldn't save anyone. He fell silent. 2 months is a long time. Bren Hollow had changed during that time, not on the outside, on the inside. After the battle, people began arriving in the city. Not merchants, refugees. Families from villages to the north who'd heard that the creature had been stopped here. A blacksmith and his apprentice from Olma, a herbalist with 2 children, a former guard missing an arm, a former miner with a dust-induced cough. People the world had written off, useless by Arkland's standards, without rank, no family, no resources. Mina took everyone in. She registered them, she counted them, she assigned them. Rosalind was in charge of housing. They worked together to rebuild the ruined houses. Dan provided the blueprints. The system showed how to reinforce the foundation with stones and clay, how to make the walls warmer with what was available, how to use broken roof tiles as insulation rather than trash. Abby taught. Not just Dan, everyone. She started evening classes in the workshop, the basics of alchemy, the properties of materials, safety precautions when working with compounds. 10 people came to her, then 20, then 30. People who had never sat at a desk listened as a renegade from the guild explained why willow bark resonates with magical energy and how to properly dry quartz sand. Rosalind stood at the forge every day. Thorn became her mentor, silently, without explanation. He demonstrated, she repeated. After a month, her work was at the level of an apprentice with 3 years of experience. Veil steel came out at 85% of the standard, then 87, then 89. Thorn said that in a year she would surpass him. He wasn't joking. Hedjin grew up, not physically, internally. Her signs became the language of the workshop, then the language of the city. People stopped ignoring her. They began to wait. What's written on the sign today? What the next order is, when the reception is. A small, mute girl became the center of communication in a city that had previously not communicated with one another. Dan saw this and thought that Hedjin didn't need a voice artifact. She needed people who wanted to listen. But he worked on it anyway, at night, when Claire wasn't looking. A set of 6 bells, each with a unique tone, each tuned to a specific frequency that didn't just sound a note, but carried meaning. The system helped with calibration. 1 tone for yes, another for no, a third for attention, a 4th for danger, a 5th for come here. The 6th, Dan spent the longest time tuning the 6th one. He didn't know what meaning to give it. Then he understood. The 6th bell simply sounded like Hedjin. Her voice, her tone, the sound that, according to the system, corresponded to the resonance of her body, her breathing, her heartbeat. A sound she had never made, but that was her. He finished the set on the 43rd day. He placed it on the table in front of Hedjin, without a word. She unfolded the cloth. She saw 6 bells, small ones, bronze with silver thread. She touched the first one. The sound echoed through the workshop. Pure, clear. She touched the second one, the third, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th. The 6th bell rang out, and the workshop fell silent. So-Yun looked up from the blade. Abby looked up from the mortar. Rosalind turned away from the bellows. Mina set down her abacus. Even Thorn stopped. There was a sound. How to describe a sound that sounds like a person? Warm, quiet, real. Hedjin held the bell, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She rang it, again and again. Not for information, not for a command, just to make a sound. For the first time in her life, she made a sound, and the whole city heard it. Dan sat at the table and watched her, and thought that this was what it was all for. Not for the battles, not for the rot, not for world-class recipes. For this face, these tears, this sound. For the moment when a person who hadn't been heard in 20 years finally made a sound. Alongside the life of the city, Dan was preparing an expedition. So-Yun trained every day. The star iron blade in her hands sang. Dan made her a new scabbard with a lining that slowly restored the blade's coating. Not completely, 15% per hour, but that was enough to keep the sword always partially ready. For Abby, he assembled a portable alchemy kit, 12 containers, each with an inner lining that isolated the contents from the neighboring ones. Sulfuric anhydride next to lunar salt, and no reaction. Abby opened the kit and didn't speak for 5 minutes. Then she said it was the best tool she'd ever seen in her life. Then she asked if she could add a 13th container for iron vine extract. Dan added a 14th, just in case. He worked especially long hours for Claire. She wasn't a warrior, she was a healer, and her pain was that she couldn't cure the rot. Her hands and herbs worked on ordinary wounds, but the corruption penetrated deeper, into the blood, into the bone, into the very structure of the body. And ordinary medicines didn't detect it until it was too late. Dan made her a diagnostic tool. A thin needle made of veil steel with a quartz tip. Upon touching the skin, the needle read the composition of the tissues. Not like the system, simpler, rougher, but enough to see traces of the rot before symptoms appeared. Claire took the needle. She touched her own hand. She looked at the quartz tip. It glowed pure white, no traces of the rot. She touched Dan's finger. The tip flashed greenish, once, barely noticeable. Claire looked up. Dan knew. Contact with the creature had left a trace. Insignificant, but a trace. Claire said quietly that now she could see. For the first time in 3 years of working on the northern border, she could see the enemy before it killed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stood there, holding the needle. And Dan realized that to her, this tool meant the same thing as the bells meant to Hegan. A voice, the chance to do what you were made for. For Mina, he made a chest, a small one, out of wood reinforced with quartz dust, with a lock made of veil steel. An artifact chest, protected against water, fire, and impact. Mina was thrilled. The perfect place to store valuables. Then she opened it and saw an envelope inside. She unfolded it. Inside was a letter. Not from Dan, from the whole team. Everyone had written a line. So-Yun wrote that Mina was annoying, but without her, the workshop would have fallen apart in a week. Abby wrote that Mina was the only person who listened to her rambling without interrupting. Rosalind wrote that she respected someone who turned chaos into order. Heijin drew a little bell. Claire wrote that she was glad to have met her. Thorn wrote, tolerable. Mina read the letter. Then she reread it. Then she folded it up and put it back in the chest. She closed the lid. She looked at Dan. And for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she didn't say a word. On the 60th day, Dan announced that the expedition would set out in a week. The team, himself, So-Yun, Abby, Claire, 4 of them. Rosalind stays. The town needs her. The forge, veil steel, training. Without her, the workshop won't survive. Heijin stays. She's the voice of the workshop. Without her, the town will lose its connection. Mina stays. Logistics, supplies, reputation management. Without her, the caravans will stop coming. Rosalind nodded, coldly. But in her eyes, Dan saw fear. Not for herself, for him. Heijin wrote on a sign, "Come back." Mina said that if he didn't come back, she'd sell his tools. Then she added that she was joking. Then she turned. Thorn said a spot in the barn would be waiting. Then he corrected himself. In the workshop. Kai hugged Dan, just ran up and hugged him, silently. Dan stood there not knowing where to put his hands. Then he hugged him back. The next morning, the 4 of them walked out through the north gate of Bren Hollow, So-Yun in front, a blade at her side. Abby with a bag and an alchemy kit. Claire with a bag of herbs and a diagnostic needle. Dan with a bag of tools and materials. Lines before his eyes showed the way. Every stone, every tree, every blade of grass. And at every 5th position, a greenish note flickered. traces of rot. Faint, barely noticeable, like dust on a shelf. They were heading north, to where the sky ached. The journey north took 14 days. With each passing day, the world around me changed. The greenery faded. The trees stood gray. Not dead, gray, as if the color had been drained from them. The lines before Dan's eyes showed. The soil's magical conductivity was 0.3 units, then 0.7, then 1.4, then 3. The numbers grew with every kilometer. The earth was saturated with unfinished craft. The network the recipe spoke of existed. It was everywhere, underfoot, in the stones, in the trees, in the air, invisible to everyone but Dan. And it was sick. The network was trying to complete itself. It was grabbing matter, processing it, integrating it, spitting out what didn't fit. Rot was a byproduct, production waste, like shavings from a lathe. Only the shavings were poisonous and lived a life of their own. On the 5th day, they passed through a dead village. The houses stood intact, doors open, belongings in place, but there were no people, and the lines showed why. Consumed. Every object in every house had a mark, partially consumed. Chair, status, 45%, 55% consumed. Wall, status, 30%, 70% consumed. The village wasn't destroyed. It had been eaten, slowly, by the percentage. People left when things started melting in their hands, or maybe they didn't leave. Claire looked at the empty houses and said nothing. Her hands didn't tremble, but her face became like a mask. She had seen this before, in the monastery. She knew what it looked like when the world around you stopped being solid. On the 8th day, they encountered the creatures. Not just one, a pack. Small ones, about the size of a cat. Gray-green blobs that crawled across the ground like slugs. So-Yun hacked at them without stopping. The sheath's coating restored the blade between strikes. Abby threw vials containing a substance that, upon contact with Gani, caused disintegration. A new formula. She'd developed it on the road from ingredients she'd gathered along the way. Claire checked each one after a skirmish, with a needle, a quartz tip. Clean, clean, clean. All clean. On the 12th day, the lines before Dan's eyes became illegible. Too much data. Every square meter of land screamed with information. Magical conductivity, 47 units. 52, 61. The numbers jumped. The system was choking. Dan stopped. He closed his eyes. The lines didn't fade. They burned through his eyelids. He tried to focus, to filter. Like in a warehouse when the database freezes from overload and you need to set a filter by category. He mentally set the filter. Show only artificial structures. The lines narrowed. Instead of thousands, there were only a few dozen left, and they all pointed in one direction. Forward, north, down. On the 14th day, they found the source. It was a pit, huge, half a kilometer in diameter, deep. The bottom was invisible. The edges were melted, not by fire, by something else. The lines indicated it, the point of initiation. Step 1 of the recipe was carried out here. Age, over 300 years. The network began here. 300 years ago, someone stood in this spot and began crafting the world. Dan approached the edge. He looked down. The lines unfolded vertically. Along the walls of the pit, the network's lines ran like veins, bluish, pulsating, alive. And among them, one line was different. Not blue, golden, thin, barely visible. It ran upward from the bottom of the pit and faded away. The system provided a description. Communication channel, inactive. The creator's tool, a fragment. Compatibility with the current system, 94%. Dan stopped breathing. The creator's tool, a fragment. His system was a fragment of the tool that had been used to create this network, this pit, this catastrophe. Whoever had begun crafting the world had used the same menu from nothing, the same logic, the same vision. Only the scale was different. Not nails and roof tiles, continents and rock formations. And that someone made a mistake on the 7th step. Just as Dan had made a mistake in the warehouse, just as anyone does who takes on a job too big for them alone. So-Yeon stood nearby. She looked into the pit. She asked quietly what he saw. Dan replied that he saw the beginning and the end. He sat down on the edge of the pit. The system displayed the complete recipe, all 12 steps, 7 completed, an error on the 7th, 4 not started, and 1 new one, which hadn't been there before. Step 13. It wasn't in the original recipe. The system added it itself, or Dan added it, or the world added it. Step 13. Take apart and reassemble. Break down the unfinished craft into components. Fix the error on the 7th step. Rebuild, or don't rebuild. The choice is up to the master. Dan looked at this step and understood. He could dismantle rot. Not just one creature, the whole thing, the entire network, the entire unfinished craft that had been devouring the world for 3 centuries. But to do that, he would have to do what the creator couldn't: finish the work, or undo it. Both required resources he didn't have, time he didn't have, strength he didn't have. He was just one person, with hands that ached after 4 hours of work, with eyes that were giving out from overload, with a body that weighed 4 kilograms less than it should. Abby approached, sat down next to him, looked into the pit, said the pit looked like a crucible, a giant alchemical crucible. That if you look at the network as a reaction rather than a structure, the error on the 7th step is the wrong catalyst. Too strong. The reaction went out of control, like acid without a buffer. We need a buffer. Dan looked at her. A buffer? Something to slow down the reaction, not stop it, slow it down. Give us time. Give us control. Abby smiled. That very smile, not a sarcastic one, a genuine one. And she took container number 7 out of the alchemy kit. Willow extract, the very one, the base of the coating. A substance that resonates with magical energy, weakly, barely noticeably, 0.2 units per gram. But it resonates. It doesn't suppress. It doesn't amplify. It resonates. It falls into the rhythm and gently slows it down. A buffer. So-Yeon looked at both of them. She asked if they needed to climb into the pit. Abby said yes. So-Yeon sighed. She looked at the blade. She looked at the pit. She said she'd go first. The descent into the pit took 3 hours. So-Yeon went first, the blade in one hand, the rope in the other. Dan followed her. Abby followed Dan. Claire brought up the rear. The walls of the pit were warm, not hot, warm like the skin of a living creature. The lines before Dan's eyes burned so brightly that he could barely see the real world. Numbers, formulas, recipes, data poured out like water from an open faucet. Lines of the grid pulsed around them, blue, rhythmic. Each carried an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. And among them, a golden line, thin, quiet. It led downward, to the bottom. The bottom of the pit was empty. A flat stone melted into glass, smooth, black. And in the center of the flat stone lay an object, small, the size of a palm. The lines unfolded and Dan stopped. The Creator's tool, the core. Magical conductivity 10,000 units. Condition damaged. Integrity 31%. Compatibility with current system 94%. Function control of the global network. Status failure. Error at step 7. Awaiting input. 300 years. For 300 years, this thing had lain at the bottom of the pit, waiting for someone to pick it up and tell it what to do. Complete or cancel. Dan walked to the center. He stood over the object. It looked like a crystal, irregularly shaped, with a crack down the middle. Dull. But when Dan reached out, the crystal flared to life. A golden light struck the ceiling of the pit. Lines before his eyes exploded. Not data. Memories. Someone else's. A person. A man, young, standing in this very spot 300 years ago. The crystal in his hands. Whole. Bright. Golden. He looks at the world and sees it as Dan sees a nail. As a set of components. As a problem that can be solved. The world is starving. The earth is depleted. Magic is dying. He wants to fix it, wants to rebuild it. He wants to make a world that works. Not for himself, for everyone. He begins to craft. Step by step, years of work. Alone, without a team, without help, without anyone to say, stop. You're tired. You're wrong. Go to sleep. The 7th step. He's tired. His eyes can't see. His hands are shaking. He makes a mistake. The catalyst is too powerful. The reaction is going the wrong way. The network is spiraling out of control. He tries to stop it. He can't. The crystal shatters in his hands. The world begins to devour itself. One last thought. I've ruined everything again. Dan pulled his hand away. His heart was pounding. Sweat was streaming into his eyes. He looked at the crystal and saw himself in it. That version of himself, from the warehouse. The one who stayed behind after his shift to rearrange the pallets. The one who always did it alone because he didn't know how to ask for help. The one who believed that if you ask, it means you're weak. That meant you were useless. That meant you weren't needed. That man 300 years ago was just the same. A storekeeper on a universal scale. With golden hands and the conviction that he had to manage on his own. And he didn't manage. Because one person can't rebuild the world. Dan dropped to his knees before the crystal. He closed his eyes. Lines burned through his eyelids. The system awaited a command. Complete or cancel. 2 options. Both impossible. To complete a world-scale craft, alone, with his own hands, which ached after 4 hours of work. Unrealistic. Cancel. Dismantle the network that had entangled the continent over 300 years. Alone. Unrealistic. Dan opened his eyes. He looked at So-yeon. She was standing nearby, a blade in her hand, ready to defend him from anything. He looked at Abby. She was holding an alchemical set, 14 vials, each with the answer to a question that hasn't been asked yet. He looked at Claire. She was standing with a needle, ready to see what others cannot, to see it in time, to save him before it's too late. He isn't alone. That was the thought that changed everything. He isn't alone. He never was alone. Not from the moment the boy ran off with the hammer. Not from the moment He-jin brought the bowl of porridge. Not from the moment So-yeon said she would protect him. He just hadn't noticed. Because he was used to not noticing. Because in the warehouse there were colleagues nearby, not a team. But here, there was a team nearby. Dan took the crystal. The system flashed to life. Full access to the global network. All 12 steps, all parameters, all data. An error on the 7th step was flashing red. The catalyst is too powerful. The reaction is uncontrollable. The buffer is not installed. Dan turned to Abby. He told her he needed willow extract, all of it. Abby held out the container. Dan took it. But he didn't pour it into the crystal. He poured the extract into the pit, onto the stone, onto the walls, onto the network lines. The willow extract seeped into the blue lines, and they slowed down. The pulsation became less frequent, smoother, calmer. The buffer was working. The reaction slowed. For the first time in 300 years, the grid stopped devouring the world around it. It didn't stop, but it slowed enough for Dan to read, to see, could think. He raised the crystal to eye level. The system asked, finish, cancel, overwrite. A third option, one that hadn't been there before. Overwrite. The system added it because now it had full access, because the buffer had bought time, because Dan wasn't alone. Overwrite the recipe. Don't complete someone else's. Don't cancel someone else's. Write his own, from scratch. Correct the error in step 7. Replace the catalyst, add a buffer, and start over. Not alone, not by himself, with a team, with people who see what he doesn't. Abby sees chemistry. Claire sees the body. So-yeon sees the threat. Rosalind sees steel. He-jin sees people. Mina sees connections. Thorn sees the craft. Each of them sees a single piece of the world, and together they see the whole. Like a warehouse team. One knows where everything is, another knows how to carry it, a third knows where to put it, and only together do they unpack the shipment in a single shift. Dan closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the crystal, and chose. Rewrite. The system accepted the command. The lines unfolded like never before, the complete recipe for the world. Not someone else's, his. Step 1. The same basic materials: earth, stone, water, wood, metal, already gathered. Over 300 years, the network has gathered enough. Step 2. Structuring. The network exists. It needs to be fixed, not rebuilt. Fixed, like straightening a bent nail. Not thrown away, straightened. Step 3. Saturation. There is energy. The network has accumulated enough for 10 crafts. Step 4. Awakening. It has already happened, 300 years ago. Step 5. Tuning. This is where something new begins, something that wasn't in the original. Dan didn't tune the network alone. He included a team in the recipe. Every node in the network needs a caretaker, not a controller, not a high-ranking master, a person who sees, who understands, who cares. Workshops. Across the continent. Not just one, hundreds, thousands. Workshops built from nothing, where people learn to see materials, to see each other, to see the world not as a pile of trash, but as a warehouse full of possibilities. Step 6. Stabilization. A buffer based on willow extract is built into the network as a permanent element. The reaction will no longer accelerate. Step 7. Corrected. The catalyst has been replaced. Instead of one powerful one, 1,000 weak ones. Distributed. Every node in the network is a small catalyst. Every workshop, every person who sees and cares. Not a single craftsman god, 1,000 ordinary people. Step 8 and beyond. Dan didn't write them. He left them blank. Because the world doesn't need to be finished. The world needs to be set in motion and let go. Let it be on its own. Let it be crooked. Let it be slow, but on its own. Like a child who was given a hammer and told to go build. Dan placed the crystal in the crack at the bottom of the pit, right where it had fallen 300 years ago. The crystal fit like a key in a lock. The grid flashed. Not blue, gold. For a second. Then it went out, and flashed again, smoother, calmer, quieter. The pulsation slowed to the rhythm of breathing. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. The world was breathing. The walls of the pit were no longer warm. They became normal, stone. The lines before Dan's eyes flickered and changed. Recipe rewritten. Process stabilized. Buffer active. Error on step 7 corrected. Autonomous absorption mode disabled. Rot. Deactivation in progress. Estimated time to full neutralization, 14 months. Dan read the lines, and his hands were shaking. 14 months. Not instantly. Not tomorrow. More than a year. The rot won't disappear overnight. It will retreat. Slowly. Meter by meter. Kilometer by kilometer. The earth will be cleansed. The trees will regain their color. The soil will cease to be poisonous. But it will take time. And someone will have to help. Heal the earth. Purify the water. Restore the villages. Build workshops. Teach people to see. Work for years. For decades. Not for one person. For everyone. So-Yun stood nearby and looked at the walls of the pit. The blue lines pulsed evenly, calmly. She said the sky above had changed. They had climbed up. 3 hours up. When Dan emerged from the pit, he looked north. The gray-green wall was gone. The sky was gray. Just gray. Overcast. Ordinary. Clouds. Not poisonous. Not sick. Ordinary autumn clouds. Abby sat down on the ground at the edge of the pit and laughed. Not sarcastically. Not dryly. Genuinely. So-Yun stuck her sword into the ground. She leaned her forehead against it. She stood like that for a minute. Claire looked north, at the sky, at the ground that was still gray but was no longer dead. She pressed her hand to her chest, and for the first time in 3 years, her face softened. The return journey took 12 days. Easier, faster. There were no creatures. The rot was receding, slowly but noticeably. The trees along the roadsides stood gray, but at the tips of the branches, Dan saw lines. Status 3%. Recovery has begun. 3%. Not 0. 3. They returned to Bren Hollow at noon. Hagen saw them first. She was standing at the gate with a sign, "Prepared," written in advance. There was one word on the sign. Finally. Then she saw Dan's face. She saw his smile, and she rang the 6th bell, that very one. Her voice. The sound echoed through the town. People poured into the streets. Mina ran out of the workshop with a scream that Dan heard 2 blocks away. Rosalind stood by the forge with tongs in her hands and smiled. So-Yun entered the workshop. She took off her sword, hung it on the wall, sat down on the threshold. Kai ran up to Dan, hugged him. Thorn stood in the doorway of the smithy. He nodded. Once. Dan stood in the middle of Bren Hollow, the town he had found in the mud. A town he had built from trash, from broken things and broken people. The lines before his eyes showed every house, every wall, every nail. But he wasn't looking at the lines. He was looking at the faces. At Hei Jin with her bells, at Mina with her order book, at Rosalind with her pliers, at Abby with her alchemy kit, at Claire with her needle, at So-Yeon in the workshop doorway, at Thorn in the forge, at Kay with the hammer Dan made on the first night. Things made from trash, people from nowhere, a workshop made from nothing, and a world that had been fixed because someone had finally stopped trying to fix it alone. Dan entered the workshop. He sat down at the table. A blank piece lay before him, a scrap of metal, rusty, crooked. The lines unfolded as usual. Condition 8%. Available recipes 156. He took the blank in his hands. The familiar weight, the familiar cold of the metal, the familiar lines. Nothing had changed. And everything had changed. He didn't save the world. He gave the world instructions for self-assembly. Like the markings on a box, like a barcode on a product, like a label on a shelf. Here's what's in here. Here's what it's made of. Here's what you can assemble from this. The world will do the rest on its own. And Dan will do what he knows how to do. He'll take the scraps. He'll look at the person next to him. He'll understand what they need. And he'll assemble a thing. Not just anything. A thing for you. He placed the blank on the table. He smiled. And he began to work.